Hey guys, tonight we begin with the absurd, deadly and inexplicably alcoholic disaster that was the London beer flood of 1814. The day when thousands of gallons of beer decided gravity was more important than staying in barrels and proceeded to drown a London neighbourhood in what sounds like a fraternity's fever dream, but was actually a horrifying tragedy. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is for you. It is always fascinating to see who is joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are living in London, October 1814, Monday afternoon, specifically Monday the 17th of October. The date matters, because this is the day you are going to witness something so bizarre, so unexpected, so utterly ridiculous, that if someone told you about it beforehand, you'd assume they were drunk. Which is ironic, because by the end of today, half your neighbourhood will be, involuntarily, not from drinking, from drowning, in beer, actual beer. This isn't a metaphor. This isn't hyperbole. This is what actually happened on a Monday. Because, of course, the universe saves its most ridiculous catastrophes for Mondays. You live in St. Giles, the parish of St. Giles, which sounds nicer than it is. St. Giles is poor, desperately poor, crushingly poor. The kind of poor where families of 8 share one room, where disease is rampant, where life expectancy is maybe 30 if you are lucky. It is one of London's worst slums, one of the notorious rookeries, criminal, dangerous, desperate. But it is home, your home. The only home you can afford. You share a basement room with your family, your spouse, your children, maybe your parents, maybe your siblings. Everyone lives together, because rent is expensive even for a basement that floods when it rains. That smells like sewage, that never sees sunlight, that is cold in winter and somehow colder in summer. But it is shelter, it is roof, it is survival. That is all you can ask for. In St. Giles, in 1814, that is luxury. Having a basement that only sometimes fills with sewage. Today it is going to fill with something else. Something you never imagined. Something impossible. Beer. Let's talk about the Moo and Company Brewery, or as it is known locally, the Horseshoe Brewery, because its location on Tottenham Court Road is shaped like a horseshoe, or was, or something. The name doesn't matter. What matters is the size. This brewery is massive, huge, industrial, revolution massive. This isn't some quaint operation with wooden barrels and happy brewers. This is factory brewing, mass production, capitalism in liquid form. The brewery produces beer on a scale that would make modern corporations jealous. Thousands and thousands of gallons, daily stored in enormous vats. Not barrels. Vats. The difference matters. Barrels are manageable, human-sized. Vats are architectural. Engineering projects, structures that dwarf buildings. The largest vat at the Horseshoe Brewery holds 3,500 barrels of beer. That is not a container. That is a wooden lake, a beer lake, held together by wooden staves, iron hoops, hope, prayer, Victorian engineering confidence, which, as we're about to learn, is not the same as Victorian engineering competence. The vat is 22 feet tall, let that sink in, 22 feet. That is a 2-story building made of wood, filled with liquid, fermenting liquid, pressurized liquid, heavy liquid. Beer weighs roughly the same as water, about 8 pounds per gallon. Do the math. 3,500 barrels. Each barrel is about 36 gallons. That is 126,000 gallons. That is over 1 million pounds of beer. 1 million pounds. Held by wood, and iron, and hope. Sitting in the middle of London, next to a residential neighbourhood. Next to St. Giles. Next to basements full of families next to you. This seems fine. This seems safe. This seems like absolutely nothing could go wrong. The Victorians thought so too. They were wrong. It is about 5:30 in the afternoon, the 17th of October, 1814. You are in your basement, doing whatever people do in basements in 1814, which is mostly existing. Surviving, trying to stay warm as evening approaches, trying to figure out what is for dinner, which is probably nothing, maybe some bread, maybe some cheese if you are lucky, maybe some beer. Cheap beer, watered beer, not good beer, not the beer they make at the Horseshoe Brewery. That is for people with money. You don't have money, you have basement, and family, And hope, fragile hope. That today will be like yesterday. That tomorrow will come. That nothing catastrophic will happen. That hope is about to be tested. Severely. Suddenly, wetly, there is a sound. A crack. Not loud. Not yet. Just a crack. Like wood splitting. Which it is. One of the iron hoops holding the massive vat together has failed. Snapped. Broken. The metal has fractured. Why? Age. Corrosion. Pressure. Physics. The constant strain of holding 1 million pounds of beer. The hoop has been under tension for months. Years maybe. Metal fatigues. Metal fatigues. Metal breaks. The hoop breaks. The wooden staves it was holding shift. Bulge outward. The pressure inside the vat increases on the remaining hoops. They strain. They stress. They hold. Barely for now. The brewery workers notice. Of course they notice. There is a massive crack in a massive vat. They inspect it. They discuss it. They debate what to do. Should they drain the vat? Should they reinforce it? Should they panic? They choose option 4, wait and see, because draining the vat is expensive. Reinforcing is complicated. Panicking is unprofessional. So they wait and see. They see disaster. They just don't know it yet. The vat holds for now, for an hour, maybe 2. The workers go about their business. This has happened before. Hoops break sometimes. Vats creak. Wood groans. That is normal. That is expected. That is industrial brewing. Nothing to worry about, until suddenly, violently, catastrophically, everything to worry about. It is after 5:30 p.m, getting dark, getting cold. October evening in London. You are still in your basement, still existing, still surviving. And then, the sound. Not a crack this time. An explosion. A roar. A catastrophic failure of wood and physics. The vat has ruptured completely. Totally. The remaining hoops have failed simultaneously. The wooden staves have burst outward. The pressure has won. The beer has escaped. 3,500 barrels. 126,000 gallons. Over 1 million pounds of beer. Released. Instantly. Violently. Unstoppably. Into the brewery. Onto the floor. Against other vats. This is bad. This is about to get worse. Much worse. Because the wave of beer from the first vat hits the other vats. Knocks into them. Crashes against them. Adds its pressure to their pressure. And they fail. One after another, like dominoes, like catastrophe. Like the universe deciding that one vat of beer wasn't enough tragedy. Let's add more. Let's add several more. Within seconds, several vats rupture. Several more millions of pounds of beer join the flood. The total is now astronomical. 388,000 gallons, almost 400,000 gallons, of beer, released, flooding, destroying, moving fast. The beer explodes out of the brewery, through doors, through walls, through windows. The building can't contain it. Nothing can contain it. It is a tsunami. A beer tsunami. 8 feet tall. 8 feet of liquid. Of pressure. Of unstoppable force. Moving at the speed of collapse, of gravity. Of catastrophe. It hits the street. Tottenham Court Road. Great Russell Street. New Street. The surrounding streets. All hit simultaneously. All flooded simultaneously. All drowned in beer. Liquid. Brown liquid. Foaming liquid. Smelling of hops and molten disaster. Flowing downhill. Seeking low ground. Seeking basements. Seeking you. You hear it before you see it. In your basement, you hear a roar. Like thunder, like waterfall. Like something massive and liquid and wrong moving toward you. Fast, you look up. At the small basement window, the window at ground level, the window that lets in a tiny bit of light, and you see it, brown, foaming, moving. Beer. A wave of beer, flooding beer, and then the window breaks, and the beer comes in, not trickling, not seeping, exploding. The pressure, the volume, the force. It bursts through your window, through your door, through any opening, any weakness. The beer fills your basement fast, so fast, faster than you can react, faster than you can escape, faster than you can understand what is happening, because what is happening is impossible. Basements don't flood with beer. Basements flood with sewage, with rainwater, with misery. But not beer. This doesn't happen. Except it is happening. Now to you, to your family, to your neighbours, to everyone in St. Giles, to everyone in basements, to everyone at ground level, to everyone who thought today was just Monday. The beer is cold. That is the first thing you notice as it hits you, as it covers you, as it rises around you. Cold, shockingly cold. Beer is stored cold. Fermentation requires cool temperatures. The vats were in cellars, cool cellars. The beer maintained that temperature, so the wave hitting you is maybe 50 degrees Fahrenheit, maybe 10 degrees Celsius. That is cold, that is shocking, that is immediately dangerous. Cold water kills. Cold beer kills faster, because it is thicker, harder to move through, harder to swim in, harder to escape. The viscosity, the stickiness. The liquid is thicker than water, clingy, like swimming in syrup, like drowning in molasses. Like the universe decided drowning wasn't hard enough. Let's make the liquid sticky. Let's make escape harder. Let's make death certain. You are trying to swim, trying to reach the surface, but the basement is small. The ceiling is low. The beer is rising. Fast, it is already waist. Deep chest, deep neck. Deep, you are pushing your family up, your children up, your spouse up, trying to get them to the ceiling, to the air pocket, to safety. Some make it, some don't. The beer keeps coming, keeps rising, keeps filling. The basement is full, completely full, floor to ceiling, no air, no space, no escape, just beer. Cold beer, thick beer, deadly beer. You are underwater, under beer, holding your breath, trying to find the door, the window, the stairs. Any way out, but you can't see. The beer is opaque, brown, dark, like drowning in mud, like drowning at night, like drowning blind. Your lungs are burning. You need air. You need surface. You need out. But there is no out. Just beer. Just cold. Just death. This is how you die. Drowned. In beer in a basement. On a Monday, this is the stupidest death imaginable. And it is real. And it is happening. And it has happened to 8 people. Maybe 9. The records are unclear. Because Victorian record keeping was as good as Victorian engineering. Which is to say not good at all. Let's talk about who dies, because people die. Real people with names, with families, with lives. Not just statistics, not just numbers. People. Eleanor Cooper, 14 years old, servant girl, working in a basement, trapped when the beer hit, drowned, never had a chance. Sarah Bates, a child. Details unclear, but a child, dead in beer. Hannah Banfield, teenager. Same story, same basement, same death. Catherine Butler, mother of 4. In a basement tavern, ironic. Working in a place that serves beer, killed by beer. Anne Seville, 60 years old. At a tea party in a basement. Because even in poverty, people try to maintain normalcy. Try to have tea. Try to socialize. Try to live. The beer crashed through. The tea party ended. Anne died. Others followed. The exact count is debated. 8 confirmed, maybe 9. All drowned, all in basements, all in beer, all on a Monday afternoon. All because Victorian engineering thought, that seems sturdy enough, was an acceptable building standard. But drowning isn't the only way the beer kills. Let's talk about the secondary effects, the aftermath, the consequences. Because 6 gallons of beer doesn't just flood and disappear, it stays. It sits. It ferments. Beer is alive. Sort of beer contains yeast. Active yeast. Fermenting yeast. Yeast that consumes sugar produces alcohol. Produces carbon dioxide. Produces gas. In normal circumstances, in barrels, this is controlled, managed. Expected, but in the open. In basements. In the street, it is uncontrolled, unmanaged. Dangerous. The beer sitting in basements, in homes. In the street, it is fermenting, actively, producing HOR, carbon dioxide, a heavy gas, heavier than air. It sinks, concentrates, accumulates, in low-lying areas in basements, where people are, where survivors are, where rescuers are, where anyone trying to salvage anything is. The gas displaces oxygen silently, invisibly, odorlessly. You don't notice. Until you're dizzy, until you're unconscious, until you're dead. This almost claims more victims. Several people collapse, several nearly die. From seal, poisoning, from suffocation, from secondary drowning, dry drowning, gas drowning. Beer keeps killing, even after the flood, even after the wave, even after the obvious danger passes. The beer stays dangerous, stays deadly, stays catastrophic. And then there is the smell. Oh God, the smell. 400,000 gallons of beer spilled, soaking into wood, into earth, into everything. Beer smells. When fresh, beer smells like hops, like malt, pleasant, familiar. But when spilled, when stagnant, when fermenting uncontrolled in the streets, when mixed with sewage, with mud, with death, the smell is unbearable, overwhelming, nauseating, a sweet, sour, rotten stench, like a brewery and a sewer had a baby, and that baby died. The smell permeates everything, soaks into clothes, into walls, into lungs. You can taste it. The air tastes like beer, like bad beer, like beer that is gone wrong. The neighborhood reeks for weeks, for months. The beer soaks so deep into the ground, into the buildings, into the very fabric of St. Giles, that the smell lingers forever, a permanent reminder, a stinking memorial to the day the beer attacked. Let's talk about what Monday means, what the 17th of October means, to everyone who survived, to everyone who lost, to everyone who witnessed that date. That day, that Monday, it is not just date, not just calendar day, not just the 17th of October, it is the day, the beer day, the flood day, the death day, the everything changed day. That is what it becomes for survivors, for families, for witnesses, forever. Every the 17th of October, for rest of their lives. They remember, they can't not remember. They wake up, the 17th of October, any year, every year, and they know this is the day, the anniversary, the memorial, the reliving. They don't want to remember, don't want to relive, don't want to acknowledge, but they can't help it, can't stop it, can't escape it. The date arrives, the memory arrives, the pain arrives, fresh, raw, immediate, as if it just happened, as if Monday just ended, as if the beer just flooded, just killed, just destroyed. Everything again, every year, the 17th of October, brings it back, brings them back, brings everything back. The sound, the smell, the terror, the loss, the death, the catastrophe. All of it fresh, every year, same date, same memory, same pain, that never fades, never eases, never becomes bearable, just survived, just somehow, not dying from. Despite wanting to, that is the 17th of October, for them, for survivors, for families, for witnesses, forever. Every year, the worst day returns, in memory, in pain, in reliving, what can't be relived, what shouldn't be relived, what must be relived, because memory doesn't ask, doesn't wait, doesn't care, it just comes, floods, like beer, like catastrophe, like unstoppable wave of pain, of memory, of trauma, that drowns, again, and again, and again, every the 17th of October, forever. That is the date. That is the burden of surviving, of witnessing, of living through catastrophe. That marks you, forever, with date, with anniversary, with forever reminder that you almost died, that you lost everything, that you witnessed. Horror, unspeakable horror, that speaks loudly, clearly, painfully. Every the 17th of October, every year, every anniversary, forever, until death releases from annual, remembering, reliving, resuffering, what happened once, but feels like happening forever. Every year, on that date, that cursed date, that murder date, that beer flood date, the 17th of October 1814, and every year after, forever, for those who survived, who witnessed, who carry the weight, the burden, the curse of knowing what happened, what date means, what the 17th of October really is. Not just date, not just calendar day, but anniversary of catastrophe, of death, of everything, changing, forever. That is the date. That is its meaning. That is its power over survivors, over families, over witnesses, who can't escape, can't forget, can't move past the 17th of October, the day, the beer, the flood, the death, the everything that returns every year on anniversary, in memory, in pain, what should never be relived, but is. Every year, forever, that is them, that is their burden, that is their curse. The 17th of October, forever, bringing back everything. That is dates, that is anniversaries, that is trauma, working, through time, through memory, through dates. That mean more than dates, that carry, more than numbers that bring, more than memories they bring, everything, every day, every horror back, fresh, raw, immediate, every year, forever. That is the 17th of October. For beer flood, survivors, that is their forever. That is their curse. That is their lives, marked by date, by memory, by catastrophe. That happened once but feels like happening always. Every the 17th of October, forever, until death, brings forgetting, brings ending, brings release from annual torture of remembering what can't be forgotten, what shouldn't be remembered, what must be, both. Forever, that is trauma, that is anniversary, that is the 17th of October. To them, to survivors, to families, to all who carry beer flood in memory, in dates, in forever, marking of before and after, with that date, that day, that Monday, the 17th of October, 1814, and every year after, forever dividing life into before beer and after beer. That is the power, that is the curse, that is the reality of dates, of anniversaries, of trauma, living through time, through memory, through forever, carrying the weight of what happened, when it happened, and when it returns, in memory, every year, forever. That is them, that is their burden, that is the date, the 17th of October, beer flood day, forever. In their memory, in their everything, that can't escape, can't forget, can't move past that one day, that one date, that changed everything forever, and keeps changing everything, every year, when it returns, in anniversary, in memory, in pain, that is fresh, as first day every the 17th of October, forever. That is the final burden, the lasting curse, the forever weight of surviving, catastrophe, that marks you with dates, with anniversaries, with forever, reminders that you lived through, something you shouldn't have, something that changed you, something that returns, every year, to remind you, to hurt you, to keep you, in that moment, that day, that catastrophe, forever. That is the 17th of October. That is beer flood. That is the survivors trapped, in date, in memory, in forever, loop of that day, that Monday, that beer, that flood, that everything. That never, really, ended. Not for them, not ever. Just paused. Until next, the 17th of October. Until next anniversary. Until next reliving. Until next reliving. What happened once, but feels like happening forever. That is them. That is their curse. That is the date. The 17th of October. Beer flood day. Forever day. Trauma day. Memory day. Pain day. Every year. Until death. Finally, mercifully, ends it. But wait, it gets weirder. It gets more Victorian. Because this is Victorian London. And Victorians had a specific relationship with alcohol. Which is to say they consumed it constantly. Because water was unsafe. Because beer was cleaner. Because everyone drank beer. Everyone, children, adults, everyone. Beer was hydration ship. With alcohydration, beer was currency. So when 400,000 gallons of beer suddenly become available, free beer, unguarded beer, unclaimed beer, street beer, people react, predictably. They grab containers, pots, pans, buckets, cups, hats, shoes, anything that holds liquid, and they scoop. They collect, they salvage, they save the beer, not to help, not to clean up, to drink, to store, to have free beer. It is a windfall, a blessing. Never mind the bodies, never mind the death, never mind that people drowned in this beer minutes ago. It is free, it is there, it is alcohol. People are scooping beer out of basements where corpses float. People are drinking beer that is mixed with sewage, with mud, with God knows what, and getting drunk, very drunk, because beer is beer. And free beer is better than expensive beer. And Victorians had different standards, different priorities, different ideas about sanitation. Which is to say they had no ideas about sanitation. None. The germ theory of disease won't be accepted for decades. These people think disease comes from bad air, from moral failure, not from drinking beer that a corpse was floating in 10 minutes ago. So they drink. They drink a lot. They get drunk. They get very drunk. They fight. They party. They celebrate. In the streets, in the beer, in the catastrophe. It is apocalyptic and festive simultaneously. It is tragedy and party. It is death and drinking. It is the most Victorian response possible to mass death. Have a beer, literally, from the flood that killed your neighbours. Let's go back to the moment of rupture, the exact moment, because that moment is important, is horrifying, is the hinge between normal Monday and catastrophe Monday. It is 5:30 p.m, getting dark. The workers at the brewery are finishing their shifts, thinking about going home, thinking about their own beer, their own Monday night, their own normal evening. And then, the crack. Louder this time, much louder, not a small crack, not a warning crack, a failure crack, a catastrophic structural collapse crack, the sound of wood giving up, of physics winning, of disaster arriving. The workers freeze, look at the vat. The massive vat, the vat that has been there for years, stable for years, safe for years, except it is not safe anymore, not stable, not there, because it is failing, right now, right in front of them. The wooden staves are bulging, bowing outward. The remaining iron hoops are snapping, one after another, like gunshots, like explosions. Pop, pop, pop. Each hoop breaking adds more strain to the next, more pressure, more inevitability. The workers run. Of course they run. They're not stupid. They're not heroes. They're working men who want to live, to go home, to see tomorrow. So they run, away from the vat, toward the exits, toward safety, toward anywhere but here. And they make it, all of them. Every single brewery worker survives, escapes, gets out, before the vat fully ruptures, before the beer explodes, before catastrophe arrives. That is important. That is telling. The workers survive. The workers who saw the danger, who had warning, who could run, they live. The people in basements, the people in homes, the people with no warning, no chance to run, no idea what is coming, they die. That is not accident. That is location. That is class. That is who gets to see danger coming, who gets to escape, who gets to survive. The workers see, the workers run, the workers live. The poor don't see, can't run, don't live. That is the system. That is who gets warning, who gets saved. Who matters? The workers matter to the brewery, to production, to profit. They're warned. They're saved. The neighbours don't matter to anyone, to anything. They're not warned, not saved, not considered, just killed. By beer, by negligence, by system. That is the moment. That is the reality. That is the truth. Some people get to run, over days. The difference is class, location, value to capital. Always has been. Always will be. The beer hits with force, real force, physical force. Not trickling, not flowing gently, exploding. The wave is moving fast, maybe 15 miles per HR, maybe 20. That doesn't sound fast. Not car fast, not train fast. But it is fast enough, for a wave, for a wall, for 8 feet of liquid. Coming at you with unstoppable momentum, with catastrophic mass, with deadly intent. Not actual intent. Beer doesn't have intent, but it feels like intent. Feels targeted, feels personal, when it hits. When it crashes through your wall, when it fills your basement in seconds. It feels like attack, like assault, like murder, and technically, legally, it is not. It is act of God. But it feels like murder, feels intentional, feels like someone decided you should die in beer. Today, without warning, without reason, without mercy. That is what the wave feels like. To those it hits, to those it kills, to those few seconds of awareness, before drowning, before death, before everything ends. In beer on Monday, for no reason. That makes sense to anyone. Least of all you. Drowning in beer, thinking this is ridiculous, thinking this can't be real, thinking this is how I die. Yes, this is how you die, ridiculously, impossibly unfairly. In beer, welcome to history. The weird part, the footnote part, the pub trivia part, where you are not a person, not a tragedy, just a statistic, just a weird death, just entertainment, for future people who'll hear this story and laugh and shake their heads and say, imagine dying like that. While drinking beer, obviously, because irony is always on the menu, even when it is your death, your tragedy, your final Monday. It is someone else's entertainment, someone else's trivia, someone else's thank God that is not me, but it is you. It was you. It is happening to you. Right now, in this moment, in this basement, in this beer, this is your death. Not funny, not trivial, real, final, yours. Remember that. When the story is told, when the trivia is repeated, when people laugh, remember, that is real death, real person, real tragedy. Not entertainment, not joke, not trivial, real, always real. Even when absurd, especially when absurd, the absurdity doesn't erase the tragedy, doesn't diminish the death, doesn't make it less real, just makes it worse, makes it harder, makes it unrecognizable as what it is. Murder, by negligence, by indifference, by system, disguised as accident, as absurdity, as trivia, but murder nonetheless of you, of 8 people, of real lives, ended by beer, by capitalism, by act of God, that is really act of murder, systemic murder, profitable murder. But murder, remember that, when you hear the story, when you laugh, when you shake your head, remember, murder, always murder. Dressed up, hidden, absurd. But murder, you are not the only one in your basement. When the beer hits, when the wave crashes through, you are with family, with neighbors, with people, real people, with names, with lives, with hopes, with futures, that end here. Now together, in beer, there is Mary, your neighbor from upstairs. She ran down when she heard the roar, thinking to warn you, to help you, to save you. She made it to your door, just as the beer hit, so she dies with you, in your basement, trying to help. That is who dies, the helpers, the kind ones, the people who run toward danger, to save others, they die, while the selfish survive, while those who run away, who don't help, who don't care, they live. That is the reward. For bravery, for caring. Death, in beer, unremarked, unremembered, uncounted. Mary's death might not even be in the official count, might be lost, forgotten. One of the uncertain deaths, one of the maybe 8, maybe 9, maybe more. No one knows, no one counted carefully, no one cared enough to count, to record, to remember Mary. Dying, forgotten. That is the real tragedy. Not just the death, the forgetting, the not mattering, the being erased. From history, from memory, from count, dying and being forgotten. That is worse than dying. That is double death, physical death, memorial death, complete erasure. That is what happens to some of the victims, to Mary, to others. Names lost, lives forgotten, deaths uncounted. Because poor lives don't matter, don't get recorded carefully, don't get remembered completely, just estimated. Maybe 8, maybe 9, close enough. For poor people, for basement dwellers, for beer flood victims. Close enough is good enough. That is the insult, added to injury, added to death. Not just killing you, forgetting you, not counting you, not caring enough to get the number right. That is Victorian England. That is class system. That is devaluing of lives, of deaths, of people. You are not worth careful counting, accurate recording, proper memorial. You are worth maybe 8, approximately 9, several people. That is your value. That is your memorial. That is your legacy. Imprecise, uncertain, forgotten. Welcome to being poor. In history, where you don't matter. Even in death, especially in death. There is a child, trapped, in a basement, 3 houses down. 4 years old, maybe 5. Hard to tell. Small child, terrified child. Alone child. Parents were out. Working. Older sibling was watching. But older sibling ran. When the beer hit, ran up. Got out. Survived. Forgot about younger sibling. In terror, in self-preservation. Forgot. The 4-year-old is alone. In rising beer. In darkness, in terror. Screaming, crying. Calling for parents. For sibling. For anyone. But beer is loud. Flood is loud. Disaster is loud and no one hears. No one comes. No one saves. The child drowns. Alone. Terrified. Calling for help. That never comes. That can't come. That won't come. Because no one knows. No one hears. No one cares. Until later. Until after. Until parents return to beer. Soaked basement. To floating child. To worst nightmare. To complete destruction of everything. Of life. Of hope. Of future. of reason to live, their child, dead, in beer. While they were working, were trying to survive, were trying to feed family by working, by being away, by not being there. When catastrophe struck, when death came, when their child needed them, they weren't there, were working, were doing right thing, were being responsible, and their child died. Because they were responsible, because they were working, because they were good parents, trying to provide the reward for responsibility, for working, for trying. Dead child, in beer. That is Victorian poverty. That is working class life. That is the trap, work or starve. But if you work, you are not home, not protecting, not there. When catastrophe strikes, when death comes, when children need you, so they die. While you work, while you try, while you do everything right and still lose, still fail, still end up with dead child. With beer, soaked corpse, with complete failure of everything, not your fault, but your pain, your loss, your dead child, your destroyed life. Your impossible grief, that is the reward for working, for trying, for being responsible, in poverty, in Victorian England, in system that demands everything and gives nothing, but dead children and beer, soaked basements, and impossible grief. That is the deal. That is the system. That is the life. You are living until catastrophe, until death, until beer flood. Then you are not living, just suffering, just grieving, just broken, forever. That is the legacy of the beer flood, not the absurdity, not the weirdness, the broken parents, the dead children, the impossible grief, the forever damage. That is real. That is lasting. That is what matters. More than beer, more than flood, more than engineering failure, the broken people left behind. To suffer, to grieve, to somehow continue, with dead children, with impossible losses, with wounds that never heal. That is the beer flood's real legacy. The broken people, the grieving parents, the survivors, who wish they weren't, who wish they died too, who wish the beer had taken them, instead of leaving them to suffer, to remember to never escape, the moment, the loss, the beer forever. The street above is chaos, pure chaos, complete chaos. People running, screaming, falling, drowning. Beer is waste, deep in the street. Chest, deep in places. People are trying to wade through, trying to escape, trying to reach higher ground, but beer is thick, sticky, resistant, like swimming in syrup, like running in nightmare, where your legs won't move, won't respond, won't save you. The beer pulls, drags, traps. Its viscosity is enemy, is danger, is danger. People move slowly, desperately slowly, impossibly slowly, while the beer continues to come, to flow, to rise. They're not moving fast enough, can't move fast enough, won't make it. Some realize this. Midway, mid-wade, mid-escape, they realize they're not going to make it, not going to reach safety, not going to survive. You can see it in their faces. The moment of realization, the moment of understanding, the moment of accepting death in beer. Now today, their faces change. From desperate to resigned, from fighting to accepting, from alive to already gone. That is the moment when they stop fighting, stop trying, stop wading. They just stand in the beer, waiting for it to rise, to cover them, to take them. They give up, not because they're weak, because they understand they're not making it, can't make it, won't make it. So why struggle? Why fight? Why make death harder? Just wait. Just accept. Just let it happen. That is rational. That is sensible. That is horrible. To watch. To witness. To see people giving up, accepting death, standing in beer, waiting to drown, while you witness, while you survive. Because you are on second floor, because you are on higher ground, because you are lucky. Not better, not deserving, lucky. That is the difference between drowning and watching, between dying and witnessing, between victim and survivor. Luck, random luck, meaningless luck, that determines everything. Your life, your death, your fate. Luck decides, not virtue, not preparation, not deserving. Luck, always luck. In catastrophe, in disaster, in beer flood. Luck is God, is arbiter, is decider of who lives, who dies, who drowns. Luck, blind luck, uncaring luck. That is what matters, that is what saves, or kills, or watches. Luck, Nothing else. No matter what people say, no matter what preachers claim, no matter what survivors believe. It is luck, always luck, only luck. That is the truth, the unacceptable truth, but truth, nonetheless. Forever. The wave doesn't just hit basements, doesn't just hit ground level, the force, the momentum, the mass. It hits buildings, damages structures, cracks foundations, breaks walls, destroys support. 2 houses collapse. We said that. But let's talk about what that means, what collapse looks like, what it sounds like, what it does to people inside. A house doesn't collapse cleanly, doesn't fall straight down, doesn't pancake neatly. It tears, rips, comes apart violently, chaotically, lethally. Walls fall outward, inward, sideways. Roofs collapse downward. Floors drop. Everything breaks. Everything falls. If you are inside. When it happens, when the building comes apart, you don't have a chance. You are not escaping, not dodging, not surviving. You are being crushed, buried, destroyed by tons of brick, tons of wood, tons of building coming down on you. Death is instant, probably, hopefully, because being crushed slowly, being trapped under rubble, being pinned by building, that is worse. That is slower. That is conscious. That is aware. That is knowing you are dying, slowly, painfully, helplessly, under building, under rubble, under your own home. That turned against you. That killed you. That destroyed you. In instant. In catastrophe. In beer flood. Some people die like this, crushed, trapped, buried in their homes. That collapsed because of beer, because of wave, because of catastrophe. That wasn't their fault, wasn't their choice, wasn't their choice, wasn't anything they did, or didn't do, or could have done. They're just there, just existing. When catastrophe arrives, when building fails, when everything falls and they die, crushed, because they were home, on Monday, in October, in 1814, that is the reason. The only reason. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong Monday. That is all. That is everything. That is the difference between living and dying, between surviving and being crushed, between Monday night and forever dead. Location, timing, luck. That is all. That is everything. That is fate. Determined by beer, by building, by Monday, by catastrophe, by nothing that makes sense, nothing that is fair, nothing that is just random, just terrible, just real. That is death, in beer flood, in Victorian London, in poverty, in catastrophe. Real death, random death, meaningless death. But death nonetheless. Final death, real death, death that matters. To someone, to families, to people who loved them, who needed them, who lost them, to beer, to building, to Monday forever. The rescue efforts are chaos, complete chaos. How do you rescue people from beer, from a viscous liquid that is 8 feet deep in places? That is filling basements. That is everywhere. You can't pump it. Pumps in Itembabaisha Sea are primitive, barely functional, certainly not designed for thick, sticky beer. You can't drain it. Where would it drain to? The Thames. That is miles away. And downhill from here, the beer is pooling, accumulating, sitting. There is no easy way to remove it, no quick solution, no technology, just manpower, just buckets, just hope. Rescuers wade in, try to reach basements, try to pull survivors out, try to find bodies. It is difficult, dangerous. The beer is slippery. The streets are damaged. Buildings are unstable. Walls have collapsed. Foundations are undermined. The entire neighborhood is structurally compromised. By beer, by the weight, by the force, by the flood. Houses are leaning, tilting, threatening to collapse. Rescuers risk being crushed, being trapped, being drowned. In beer. While trying to save others from beer. It is absurd. It is dangerous. It is necessary. Some rescuers almost die. Some collapse from seal. Some get trapped. All get soaked in beer. They smell like beer. For days. For weeks. There is no washing it out. No escaping it. The beer is in everything. On everything they're beard's end soaked heroes. Saving people from beer, while smelling like beer, while probably a little drunk. From beer absorption, through skin, through lungs, through just existing in Sitzen gallons of airborne beer vapor. Let's talk about what beer does to a neighborhood, beyond the drowning, beyond the death, beyond the immediate catastrophe. What happens when 19 gallons of beer sits, in streets, in buildings, in earth. Beer is organic. Beer is alive. Beer rots. Beer rots. Beer changes. The beer sitting in St. Giles isn't staying fresh, isn't staying drinkable, isn't staying stable. It is fermenting. Uncontrolled fermentation. Wild fermentation. Dangerous fermentation. The yeast is eating the remaining sugars, producing alcohol. Producing acids, producing byproducts. Some toxic, some dangerous, some deadly. The beer is becoming stronger, more alcoholic, more potent. The people drinking it, the people scooping it, the people collecting it. They're getting more than beer, they're getting concentrated alcohol, getting toxic byproducts, getting dangerous liquid. But they don't know, don't care, don't stop. They drink, they collect, they store, and they get sick. Some of them, not all. But some stomach problems, poisoning, illness. From bad beer, from toxic beer, from beer that has gone wrong, but they drink it anyway, because it is free, because it is alcohol, because Victorian medicine is non-existent, and Victorian poverty is desperate. So they drink, they risk, they suffer. For free beer, for alcohol, for brief escape, from poverty, from suffering, from reality that includes beer flood, beer deaths, beer everywhere, beer forever. That is the trade. That is the choice. That is the calculation poor people make. Daily, constantly. Survival versus risk. Safety versus need. Health versus hunger. Always choosing need. Always choosing hunger. Always choosing survival. Over safety. Over health. Because survival demands everything. All the time. Without mercy. Without pause. Without choice. That is poverty. That is Victorian life. That is the people. Drinking flood beer, knowing it is risky, knowing it is dangerous, knowing it might kill them. Drinking anyway, because the alternative is definite hunger, is guaranteed pain. At least the beer might kill them, might not, might just get them drunk for a while, might give brief escape, brief relief, brief forgetting of everything terrible, everything painful, everything impossible about their lives. That is worth the risk, that is worth the danger, that is worth possible death. Brief forgetting, brief escape, brief not and feeling, the pain, the hunger, the desperation. That defines every day, every moment, every breath of poverty, of Victorian working class, of St. Giles, of them. That is why they drink. Not because they're immoral, not because they're weak, not because they're failures, because they're in pain. Constant pain, inescapable pain, unbearable pain. And beer helps, briefly, temporarily, inadequately, but helps. So they drink the flood beer, the death beer, the toxic beer, because helping a little is better than helping not at all. That is the logic. That is the choice. That is the life. In St. Giles, in poverty, in Iten Babaishasi, in aftermath of beer flood. That is still flooding, still drowning, still killing. Just slower now, through poison, through fermentation, through toxic byproducts, through desperation. That makes people drink anything, try anything. For brief moment of less pain, that is the real flood. Not the beer, the pain, the poverty, the desperation. That makes beer flood seem like opportunity, seem like windfall, seem like blessing, when it is catastrophe, when it is poison, when it is death, disguised as help, as relief, as escape. That is the cruelty, the real cruelty, making desperate people choose between certain suffering and possible death. That is the choice. That is the life. That is the system, killing people. Slowly, through choices that aren't choices, through options that aren't options, through freedom that is slavery, to poverty, to desperation, the system that demands everything and gives nothing but toxic beer and impossible choices and slow death, disguised as life. That is Victorian England. That is capitalism. That is the flood, the real flood. Not beer system, drowning everyone slowly, constantly, forever. The brewery workers have stories too. They're not villains, not monsters, not murderers. They're workers, working men, doing jobs, following orders, operating machinery. They maintained the vats. They checked the hoops. Sometimes they reported problems, when they noticed, when they had time, when supervisors listened, which wasn't always, wasn't often, wasn't enough. The workers knew. The vats were old. The hoops were stressed. The wood was aging. They knew. They told supervisors. They warned management. They said something should be done, should be fixed, should be replaced. Management said later, said expensive, said probably fine, said keep working. So they did. They kept working, kept hoping that nothing would fail, that everything would hold, that catastrophe wouldn't happen. On their shift, their watch, their responsibility. But it did happen. On Monday, on their shift, on their watch, and they ran. They escaped. They survived. And they're traumatized. Haunted. Not physically. They're fine. Physically perfectly fine. Not a scratch. Not a bruise. Not a beer stain. They got out clean. But mentally, emotionally, they're destroyed. They dream about it. The sound, the crack, the rupture, the roar of beer exploding, of catastrophe arriving, of death being born. They dream it every night. Wake up screaming, wake up crying, wake up broken. They see the victims in nightmares, in imagination, in guilt-fueled visions. The people who died, the people they couldn't warn, the people who died while they escaped, while they ran, while they survived. They see the children, the mothers, the families dead, in beer, because of vats they maintained, they operated, they worked with, they knew were dangerous, and they feel responsible, they feel guilty, they feel like murderers, even though legally, officially, morally maybe, they're not. They're workers, they're employees, they're victims of system that prioritized profit over safety, over maintenance, over care. But they don't feel like victims, they feel like killers, like accomplices, like murderers, who killed by negligence, by following orders, by not doing more, not protesting louder, not refusing. To work with dangerous vats, they didn't refuse. They worked, they obeyed, they survived, and people died, and they carry that forever. That guilt, that responsibility, that knowledge, that their work, their labor, their following orders, contributed to death, to catastrophe, to 8 people drowning in beer, that they made, that they stored, that they maintained, poorly, inadequately, fatally. That is their burden, their trauma, their forever scar. They survived physically, but died internally, died emotionally, died morally, in their own estimation, in their own judgment, in their own harsh, unforgiving, self-destroying guilt. That is the other victims of the beer flood, the survivors, the workers, the ones who escaped, but can't escape, can't forget, can't forgive themselves for surviving, for working, for contributing to catastrophe, to death, to beer flood. That killed people while they lived. They wish they died. Some of them, they wish the beer had taken them. Instead of letting them go, leaving them alive, to suffer, to remember, to carry the weight, the guilt, the responsibility for disaster they didn't cause, but feel they did. That is survivor's guilt. That is trauma. That is the hidden victims of catastrophe. The ones who live, but wish they didn't. The ones who escape, but can't escape. The ones who survive, but don't feel like survivors, feel like accomplices, feel like failures, feel like ghosts of men they were. Before Monday, before beer, before catastrophe, before everything changed, forever. The brewery itself is damaged, extensively damaged, catastrophically damaged. The vats that ruptured are destroyed, obviously, completely destroyed, broken, burst, scattered. Wooden staves everywhere, iron hoops twisted, bent, broken. The other vats, the ones that didn't rupture, they're damaged too, shifted by the wave, cracked by the pressure, weakened by the trauma of watching their brothers burst, of feeling the wave, of surviving. Barely, they're all condemned, all destroyed, all replaced. Eventually the brewery building itself is cracked, foundation damaged, walls compromised, floors weakened. The structure took immense force, immense pressure, immense trauma. When the beer exploded, when the wave hit, when everything failed, the building held, mostly, but barely. It is damaged, seriously damaged, needs repair. Extensive repair, expensive repair. The brewery faces financial ruin, possible bankruptcy, definite crisis. They lost product, lost vats, lost building integrity, lost reputation, lost trust, lost everything, except legal liability. They avoided that, through act of God, through legal maneuvering, through having expensive lawyers and poor victims. But financially they're devastated, truly devastated. The losses are immense. The repairs are expensive. The replacements are costly. The brewery barely survives. Financially, they rebuild. Eventually, they replace the vats with smaller ones, with safer ones, with better maintained ones. They repair the building. They resume operations. They continue brewing. But they're changed, forever changed, by the flood, by the deaths, by the catastrophe. They're more careful, more cautious, more aware of danger, of responsibility, of consequences. Not morally, not ethically, financially, they learned. Catastrophe is expensive. Death is bad for business. Floods cost money. So they're careful, not because they care about people, about safety, about lives, but because they care about business, about not losing money. The catastrophe. Again, that is the lesson they learned. That is the change they made. That is the improvement, such as it is. Not moral improvement, economic improvement, not caring more, losing less. That is progress. Under capitalism, don't care about people, just care about profit. And protect profit. By incidentally protecting people, as side effect, as byproduct, as accident, of protecting money. That is the change. That is the lesson. That is the improvement. Better than nothing. Worse than everything. But something. That is capitalism. That is the system. That is the brewery. After the flood, changed, slightly, for wrong reasons. But changed. That is all. That is everything. That is Victorian progress. Profit, motivated, accidentally beneficial, inadequately human. But progress such as it is. There are investigations, of course. Official investigations, inquests, hearings, testimonies, evidence gathering. The government investigates. The courts investigate. Everyone investigates, trying to understand what happened, why it happened, who is responsible, who should pay. The investigations are thorough, sort of. They interview workers. They inspect the site. They examine the vats, the broken vats, the evidence. They generate reports, long reports, detailed reports, official reports. The conclusions are predictable, act of God, unavoidable accident. No negligence, no liability, no responsibility. The brewery is blameless. The victims are unlucky. The deaths are tragic, but no one's fault. That is the finding. That is the ruling. That is the official conclusion. The unofficial conclusion. The obvious conclusion, the true conclusion, is different. Negligence. Clear negligence. Obvious negligence. The vats were too large, too poorly maintained, too dangerous. The hoops were fatigued, corroded, failing. The warnings were ignored. The complaints dismissed. The dangers accepted. As cost of doing business. As acceptable risk. As someone else's problem. Until it became everyone's problem. Until it became catastrophe. Until it became death. That is negligence. That is liability. That is responsibility. But officially, legally, it is act of God. Because God is convenient. God is blameless. God doesn't pay compensation. God doesn't face consequences. God is perfect scapegoat for human failure, human negligence, human greed. Blame God. Protect capital. That is the system. That is the finding. That is justice. Capital justice. Profit justice. Profit justice. That protects owners, sacrifices workers, ignores victims, and calls itself fair, calls itself just, calls itself civilized, while being none of those, while being opposite, while being opposite, while being system of oppression, of exploitation, of murder, by negligence, by profit motive, disguised as God's will, as unavoidable accident, as tragic misfortune. That is not misfortune. That is murder, legal murder, systemic murder, profitable murder. That is the investigation's real finding, if anyone bothered to read between lines, to see truth, to acknowledge reality. But no one does. No one bothers. No one cares. So the finding stands. Act of God. No liability. Case closed. Victims forgotten. Brewery continues. System wins. Again. Always. Forever. The neighbourhood changes forever. St. Giles before the flood was poor, dangerous, desperate. But a live community existed. Neighbours knew each other. People helped. People cared. People survived together. After the flood, that is broken. That is damaged. That is destroyed. Not by beer. By trauma. By death. By catastrophe. The survivors don't trust. Don't connect. Don't help. They're traumatized. Broken. Isolated. By what they saw. What they experienced. What they survived. When neighbours died. When community drowned. When everything failed. Trust died too. Connection died. What is left is individual survival, isolated existence, traumatized persistence. People live there still. They have to. They can't afford elsewhere, can't move away, can't escape, so they stay. In the place where the beer flooded, where people died, where catastrophe happened, they stay and they remember every day. Every moment. Every time it rains, every time they smell beer, every time they go to basement, they remember the flood, the death, the horror. It is not past. It is not history. It is present. It is now. It is forever. The trauma is permanent. The memory is constant. The fear is eternal, that it could happen again. That catastrophe could return. That death could come back. Any moment, any day, any Monday, that fear lives in everyone. Who survived, who stayed, who remembers. That is the real damage. Not the buildings, not the structures, not the physical, the psychological, the emotional, the communal. That damage is permanent, is irreparable, is forever. St. Giles after the flood is different place. Broken place, traumatized place. That never heals, never recovers, never returns to what it was, before Monday, before beer, before catastrophe, before everything changed, forever. 2 houses completely collapse, not damaged, not weakened, collapsed, destroyed, turned to rubble. By beer, by the force of the initial wave, by the weight of the pooled beer, by the structural damage. The houses just fall, crumble, pancake. Anyone inside dies, crushed or drowned, or both. The neighborhood looks like a war zone, like it was bombed, like it was attacked, but not by armies, by beer, by the brewery, by capitalism and poor engineering. The destruction is immense. Building facades are torn off, walls are missing, roofs are collapsed. The street is cratered, paved areas are torn up. The cobblestones are displaced by the force, by the current, by 500,000 pounds of liquid moving at flood velocity. It looks apocalyptic. It looks impossible. It looks like the aftermath of catastrophe, which it is. Catastrophe caused by beer. Catastrophe on a Monday. Catastrophe in one of London's poorest neighbourhoods, because of course it is. Catastrophe always hits the poor, always hits the vulnerable, always hits those least able to recover. That is not accident, that is location. The brewery is next to St. Giles because land is cheap, because poor neighbourhoods can't protest, because rich neighbourhoods would never tolerate a massive industrial brewery next door, with unstable vats, with dangerous engineering, with catastrophe waiting to happen. But poor neighbourhoods don't get a choice, don't get safety, don't get protected. They get beer floods, they get death. They get Victorian capitalism at its finest, profitable for the brewery, deadly for the poor. Tale as old as industry. Imagine you are walking home that evening, from work, from wherever you work, whatever job you have. That barely pays. That barely feeds your family. That barely keeps you alive. You are walking home, tired, exhausted, done with Monday, ready for evening, ready for rest, ready for whatever meagre dinner awaits. You turn the corner, onto your street, onto Great Russell Street, onto New Street, onto your street where you live, where your family waits, where your life is, and you see nothing, nothing familiar, nothing recognizable, nothing right. Your street is gone, replaced, transformed, destroyed. There is beer everywhere, knee-deep beer, in places deeper. Your street is flooded with beer. The smell hits you, overwhelming, overpowering, sweet, sour, wrong, beer smell, times 1,000, times impossible. You stand there stunned, confused, not understanding. This makes no sense. Streets don't flood with beer. This doesn't happen. This isn't real. But it is real. It is there. It is your street. It is beer. And then worse realization. Your family, your home, your basement. Your family is home, was home, when this happened. When the beer came. Are they alive? Are they okay? Are they drowned? In beer, in basement. In your home you run. As fast as you can through beer, through thick, through sticky beer, slowing you, holding you, stopping. But you run. Desperate run. Panicked run. Hoping, praying, begging that they're alive, that they're okay, that they escaped, that they survived. You reach your building. It is standing. That is good. That is something. The door is broken. Open beer. Flooded. You wade in. Call out. Shout names. Your spouse's name, your children's names, anyone's name. You hear nothing. No response, no answer, no life. You wade to the basement stairs. They're underwater, under beer. The basement is full, completely full. Floor to ceiling, you can see it through the doorway. Brown liquid, still liquid, dead liquid, immediately. No one survived. Not in basement, not underwater, not in beer. Your family was there. Your family is gone. Your family is drowned. In beer, in your basement. While you were working, while you were trying to provide, while you were being responsible, your family died because you weren't there, because you were working, because you did what you were supposed to do. Go to work. Provide, be responsible, and the reward, the consequence, the result. Dead family, drowned in beer, in your basement, in your home. That was supposed to be safe, was supposed to protect, was supposed to be shelter, but killed, instead, drowned. Instead, destroyed. Everything. Your life, your reason for working, for trying, for living gone. On Monday, while you worked, that is the discovery, that is the homecoming, that is the reality. For multiple people, multiple workers, multiple parents, coming home, to beer, flooded streets, to destroyed homes, to dead families, to ended lives, to impossible grief, to forever trauma. That is their Monday evening, their return from work, their discovery of catastrophe, of death, of loss, absolute loss, complete loss, forever loss, of everything that mattered. That is the moment. That defines rest of their lives. If they survive, if they don't end themselves, if they somehow continue after losing everything in beer, on Monday, while working, that moment, that discovery, that sight of beer, flooded basement, of missing family, of dead children, that is forever, that is defining, that is destroying, of person, of parent, of human, who survives, but doesn't live, not really, not anymore, just exists, just for somehow doesn't die, despite wanting to, despite needing to, despite everything, telling them to stop, to quit, to join family, in death, in peace, in ending. But they don't. They persist. They continue. They survive. Not because they want to, because they can't stop, can't quit, can't die. The body keeps living, even when the person is gone, when the parent is broken, when the human is destroyed. Body persists. Heart beats. Lungs breathe. Life continues, technically, biologically, but not really, not meaningfully, not humanly, just mechanically, just automatically, just emptily. That is survival. After catastrophe, after loss, after beer flood, that kills family. While you work, that is the survivors, the ones who came home to death, to loss, to beer, to forever broken, forever destroyed, forever walking dead, who live but wish they didn't, who breathe but wish they couldn't, who survive but wish they hadn't. That is them. That is their forever. That is the beer floods. Most lasting damage. The broken survivors, the destroyed parents, the living dead, who persist, despite everything, despite nothing, despite wanting, only to stop, but can't, so continue, forever, in pain, in loss, in beer, soaked memory, that never fades, never ends. That is the legacy, personal legacy, family legacy, forever legacy, of the beer flood, that drowns, not just bodies but souls but futures, but everything that matters, to the people who lost everything, in beer, on Monday, the 17th of October, 1814. Forever. The press covers the event, of course. Newspapers love disaster, love catastrophe, love death, especially weird death, absurd death, beer death. The coverage is extensive, detailed, sensational. Headlines scream: beer flood, catastrophic rupture, 8 dead in ale. The stories are dramatic, exaggerated. Entertainment, focused. They describe the wave, the destruction, the deaths, in vivid detail. In entertaining prose, in pub story style, they interview survivors, witnesses, bystanders. Everyone has a story, everyone saw something, everyone has opinion. The newspapers print it all. Everything, every story, every detail, every speculation. They're making money, selling papers, entertaining readers with disaster, with death, with other people's tragedy. That is the press. That is journalism. That is Victorian media. Catastrophe is content. Death is entertainment. Suffering is story. The victims are characters, not people. The deaths are plot points, not tragedies. The flood is narrative, not catastrophe. That is how it is covered. That is how it is sold. That is how it is consumed. By readers. Far away, safe, comfortable, reading about disaster, over breakfast, over tea, over their own beer, finding it fascinating, finding it entertaining, finding it horrifying, in fun way, in safe way, in not happening, to me way. That is the audience. That is the market. That is who the newspapers serve. Not the victims, not the survivors, not the broken, the comfortable, the safe, the entertained, who want stories, want drama, want disaster, as long as it is not theirs, as long as it is others, as long as it is entertainment, not reality. The press provides. The newspapers deliver. The coverage continues. For days, for weeks, until next disaster, until next story, until next entertainment. Then the beer flood becomes old news, becomes mo news, becomes no news, becomes no news. The interest fades, and the victims, the survivors, the broken, are forgotten. By press, by public, by everyone who moved on to next story, next disaster, next entertainment, leaving behind real people, real pain, real forever trauma, unremembered, uncared for entertainment that ended when stories stopped, when coverage ceased, when attention moved elsewhere. That is the press, that is the coverage, that is the legacy of the beer flood in newspapers. Entertainment for a week, forgotten forever after. Like victims, like deaths, like everything real, that gets covered, gets consumed, gets forgotten. By press, by public, by system. That values stories, not people. Entertainment, not truth. Profit, not care. That is the coverage. That is the media. That is the world. That consumes tragedy, forgets victims, moves on, always moving on, to next story, next disaster, next entertainment, never looking back, never remembering, never caring about the people behind headlines, behind entertainment, who suffer, who remember, who never forget, who never move on, who live in forever, in that moment, in that tragedy, while the world reads and forgets, in a week, in a day, in an hour, moving on, leaving behind the people who can't, who won't, who never will. Move on from the day, the beer, the flood, the deaths, the loss that defines their forever, while being everyone else's brief entertainment. That is the asymmetry. That is the cruelty. That is the truth of how tragedy is consumed by those it doesn't touch and endured, by those it destroys forever. There is a survivor, a woman named Mary Banfield, or maybe Hannah Banfield. The records are confused, inconsistent, Victorian. She is 14 years old, servant girl, working in a basement. When the beer hits, when the wave crashes, when the flood arrives, she is trapped. Underwater, under beer, in basement, drowning. She's going to die. She knows it. She accepts it. She is drowning, in beer. At 14, on Monday, that is her fate. That is her end. That is her Monday. Except she doesn't die. Not that day, she survives. Somehow, she holds her breath longer than possible, longer than human, longer than should work. She holds it, while beer floods, while basement fills, while death waits. And then the pressure equalizes. The flow stops, the beer settles, and there is an air pocket, small air pocket, tiny air pocket, at ceiling where basement ceiling meets wall, where air was trapped by beer. By luck, by chance, by miracle. If you believe in those, she finds it. The air pocket. By accident. By desperation. By flailing. By dying. Her head breaks surface. Into air pocket. Into air. Into breathing. Into life. Into survival. Against odds. Against logic. Against everything. She survives. In air pocket for hours. For long hours. For impossible hours. Breathing shallow. Breathing slow, breathing recycled air. That is running out, that is depleting, that is slowly suffocating. But slowly is better than immediately. Slowly gives time, for rescue, for hope, for maybe. She waits. In dark, in cold, in air pocket, barely breathing, barely alive, barely hoping, but still there, still alive, still breathing against everything she has rescued. Eventually, after hours, after searching, after someone hears something, investigates, finds her, in air pocket, in basement, Still alive. Impossibly alive. Miraculously alive. They pull her out, carefully, slowly, through beer, through basement, through door, into street, into air, into life, into survival. She lives. She survives. She continues. Not unscathed. She is traumatized. Damaged. Changed. Forever changed. By hours. In air pocket. In almost death. In nearly dying. In expecting death. And living anyway. That changes you. Forever changes you. Makes you different. Makes you other. Makes you survivor. With all that means. All that carries. All that burdens. But alive. She is alive. Against odds. Against logic. Against beer flood. She survived. At 14. In basement. In luck. In miracle. In statistics. One of the few. One of the lucky. One of the survivors. Who tell stories. Who remember. Who carry. The weight. The memory. The forever. Of the day. The beer. The flood. The almost death. That is Mary. Or Hannah. Or whoever she was. The records are confused. But the survival is clear. She lived. When she shouldn't. When she couldn't. When everything said she'd die. She lived. That is her story. That is her miracle. That is her forever. Surviving beer flood. At 14. In basement. In air pocket. In October. In 1914. In history. As footnote. As survivor. As miracle girl. Who didn't die. In beer. When everyone else did. That is her legacy. Her survival. Her story. Her forever. Living when she should have died. That is something. That is everything. That is miracle. Small miracle. But miracle. In catastrophe. In death. In beer flood. That kills 8. But not 9. Not Mary. Not Hannah. Not the girl. In air pocket. In basement. In luck. In survival. In life against everything. That is her. That is the story. That is the one bright point. In disaster. In tragedy. In death. One survival. One miracle. One air pocket. That saved one girl. On one Monday. In one basement. In one neighborhood. In one catastrophe. That is not much. But it is something. It is one. One life. One survival. One person who lived. When they shouldn't. That is worth remembering. Worth celebrating. Worth honoring. One survival. In 8 deaths. That is the ratio. That is the reality. That is the catastrophe. But one survived. One lived. One continued. And that matters. To her. To family. To anyone who values life. Who celebrates survival. Who honors the one who made it. When everyone else didn't. That is Mary. That is Hannah. That is the girl. In the air pocket. In the beer flood. In history. Living when she shouldn't. That is her story forever. Let's talk about the legal aftermath. Because there is legal aftermath. 8 people are dead. 2 houses are destroyed. A neighborhood is damaged. Someone is responsible. Someone must be held accountable. Someone must pay. Right? Right? Wrong. This is Victorian England. This is capitalism. This is how justice works when corporations are involved. The brewery is investigated, of course. There is an inquest, a hearing, testimony, evidence, the conclusion, ready for this. Act of God. The court rules the disaster was an act of God, an unavoidable accident. No one's fault, not negligence, not poor engineering, not insufficient maintenance. God did it. God broke the vat. God flooded the neighborhood. God killed 8 people. With beer. That is the legal finding. That is the official ruling. Act of God. Which means no one is responsible. No one pays. No one is punished. The brewery is absolved. Declared innocent. Free to continue operations. Free to rebuild. Free to keep making beer. In the same location, next to the same neighborhood. With the same safety standards. Which is to say no standards. None. The victims' families get nothing. No compensation. No apology. Just act of God. And so sorry for your loss. And back to work. That is Victorian justice. That is how it works when you are poor. When you are powerless. When you die in someone else's catastrophe. You get nothing. Not even acknowledgement. Just God's fault. Somehow. As if God specifically had a grudge against Stant Giles. As if God specifically wanted to kill poor people with beer. As if God's preferred method of divine intervention was catastrophic industrial accidents in poor neighborhoods. That is not theology. That is not justice. That is convenience. Legal convenience. Corporate convenience. Rich people convenience. The brewery suffers economically. They lose their beer, their vats, their inventory. They lose money. They have expenses. They have damages, but they don't lose legally. Don't lose ethically. Don't lose anything except beer and equipment, which can be replaced, unlike the 8 people who can't. The inquest is held days after the flood, in a courtroom, in proper Victorian fashion, with judge, with jury, with lawyers, expensive lawyers, for the brewery. No lawyers for the victims. Victims don't get lawyers. Victims get graves. The brewery presents its case, its evidence, its defense. They bring engineers, technical experts, professional witnesses, who explain about vats, about hoops, about stress, about metal fatigue, about unavoidable failure, about acts of God. They use big words, technical terms, scientific language that no one understands. That is the point. Confuse the jury, blind them with science, make it seem complicated, technical, beyond human control. The defense is effective, convincing. It works. The jury deliberates. Not for long. The decision is clear. Act of God. No liability. Case closed. The brewery celebrates. Quietly, but celebrates. They won. They're free. They're absolved. The victims' families sit in the back, in the cheap seats in the section. For the poor, they watch. They listen. They understand. Nothing. About the technical testimony, about the legal arguments, about the defense, but they understand the verdict. Act of God. No compensation. No justice. No care. They understand that perfectly, clearly, painfully. They leave, in silence, in anger, in grief, in nothing. Because they have nothing. No family, no compensation, no justice. Just grief. Just poverty. Just impossible continuation of life. Without loved ones, without support, without anything. That is the inquest. That is the justice. That is the system. Working exactly as designed. Protecting capital, ignoring people, calling it God's will, when it is man's choice, man's system, man's injustice, dressed up, made official, made legal, made acceptable. By courts, by law, by system. That serves capital, not people, profit, not justice. Rich, not poor. That is the inquest. That is the verdict. That is Victorian England, showing its true face, its real priorities, its actual values, capital over lives. Always capital over everything, including 8 dead people, including destroyed families, including any semblance of justice, of morality, of care for human life. That is the system, exposed, by verdict, by act of God, by legal absolution, of clear negligence, clear responsibility, clear guilt, made invisible by lawyers, by technical testimony, by expensive defense, that poor people can't afford, can't fight, can't defeat. So they lose, again, always, forever, in courts, in system, in Victorian England, where justice is for sale, and poor people can't afford the price. The beer sits, for days, for weeks, in streets, in basements, in earth. It can't be removed quickly, can't be drained easily, can't be disappeared. It just sits, fermenting, rotting, changing. The smell gets worse, much worse, unbearably worse. From sweet beer smell, to sour rot smell, to putrid decay smell, the beer is breaking down, decomposing, becoming toxic, becoming dangerous, becoming unbearable. The smell permeates everything, every building, every home, every person. It is in clothes, in hair, in skin, in lungs. You can't escape it, can't wash it away, can't remove it. It is there, always there, constantly there. The smell of death, of decay, of beer gone wrong. It attracts rats. Hundreds of rats. Thousands of rats. They come for the beer, for the sugar, for the fermentation. They swarm. They multiply. They infest. The neighborhood becomes rat paradise, rat kingdom, rat hell. For humans, the rats are everywhere. In basements, in walls, in homes, in beds. They're disease vectors, plague carriers, death bringers. Literally, the rats bring disease, bring sickness, bring more death. After the flood, after the drowning, after the catastrophe, the rats finish. What beer started, making neighborhood uninhabitable, unlivable, unbearable. People get sick from the beer, from the rats, from the conditions. They get fever, get stomach problems, get infections. Some die, not from drowning, From aftermath, from consequences, from secondary effects of beer flood that keeps killing. Weeks later, months later, through disease, through rats, through impossible living conditions. The flood doesn't end. When beer drains, flood continues, through consequences, through aftermath, through cascade of problems that follow, that compound, that multiply from initial catastrophe to ongoing disaster to permanent damage. That is how catastrophe works, not single event. Cascade of events, each worse, each harder, each more deadly than the last. The beer floods. People drown, beer sits, rats come. People die, more slowly, more painfully, more hopelessly than drowning. That is quick. That is mercy, compared to slow death by disease, by infection, by rat-borne plague. That kills. Days later, weeks later, when you thought you survived, when you thought you made it, when you thought the worst was over, it wasn't. It isn't. It never is. Catastrophe has layers, has stages, has cascade that continues. Long after initial event, initial disaster, initial death, the flood continues. Through rats, through disease, through slow death, of neighborhood, of community, of people who survived beer, but can't survive. Aftermath, that is worse, that is crueler, that is the real catastrophe. Not the flood, the aftermath, not the drowning, the slow death, not the Monday, the weeks, months, years of suffering. That follow, that continue, that never end. Not really, not completely, not for survivors who live, but wish they didn't, who survived, but keep dying, slowly, gradually, completely, from aftermath, from cascade, from consequences. That never end. That is the beer flood. Real beer flood. Not 8 deaths. Dozens of deaths. Hundreds affected. Thousands damaged. By flood, by aftermath, by cascade. That continues. Forever. Or feels like forever. To those who live through it. To those who survive it. To those who endure it. Against their will. Against their wish. Against everything. That tells them to quit. To stop. To die. But they don't. They persist. They continue. They somehow survive. Even aftermath, even cascade, even everything. That comes after. The beer, the flood. That never ends for them, for survivors. For the damaged, the broken, the destroyed, who live, but don't live. Not really. Not fully. Not humanly. Just exist. Just persist. Just somehow don't die. Despite everything. Despite wanting to. Despite needing to. They live. Because bodies are stubborn. Hearts keep beating. Lungs keep breathing. Even when person is gone, when human is broken, when life is over, body persists, continues. Lives against will, against wish, against everything. That makes sense. That is mercy. That is right. Body lives. Person dies. That is aftermath. That is cascade. That is beer flood. Real beer flood. That never ends. Never stops. Never drains. Just continues. Forever. Killing slowly. The ones who survived quickly. That is cruelty. That is catastrophe. That is truth. Of disaster. Of aftermath. Of cascade. That most people don't see, don't know, don't understand, because they see initial event, initial disaster, and think, that is it. That is catastrophe. That is end. It is not. It is beginning. Of cascade. Of aftermath. Of slow death. That continues. Long after, cameras leave, papers stop reporting, people stop caring, the dying continues, the suffering persists, the catastrophe lives, in bodies, in neighborhood, forever, or until everyone dies, or leaves, or forgets how to feel, how to care, how to be human. That is aftermath, that is cascade, that is beer flood, that no one talks about, that no one remembers, that no one knows, because it is boring, because it is slow, because it is not dramatic, just endless, just painful, just real, more real, than dramatic flood, than sudden death and exciting catastrophe, the slow death, the long dying, the endless suffering. That is real disaster. That is real catastrophe. That is what kills. Most people. Not the event, the aftermath, not the flood, the cascade, not the Monday, the forever, that follows, that continues, that never ends, until death, actual death, final death, mercy death, that releases from suffering, from cascade, from aftermath. That is worse than beer, worse than drowning, worse than everything that people imagine. When they hear beer flood, they don't know, they can't know, they can't know. They'll never know unless they live it, unless they endure the aftermath, the cascade, the forever. That is real beer flood, that is real catastrophe, that is real death by disaster. Not quick death by drowning, but slow death by everything after. That is the truth, the uncomfortable truth, the unspoken truth, that survivors know, that victims taught, that catastrophe proves. Every time, in every disaster, in every flood, beer or otherwise, the event is just beginning. The aftermath is catastrophe. The cascade is death, real death, slow death, forever death, that most people who died in flood avoided by dying quickly, by dying mercifully, by dying before aftermath, before forever suffering. That is maybe mercy, maybe blessing, maybe gift, compared to surviving, to continuing, to living through aftermath, through cascade, through forever. That never ends, never eases, never stops, being catastrophe, being disaster, being death, just slower, just longer, just more painful than drowning. In beer on Monday, in October, in 1814, in London, that is the truth, the full truth, the complete truth of the beer flood that no one tells, that no one knows, that no one wants to hear, because it is depressing, because it is hopeless, because it is true, too true, unbearably true. That catastrophe never ends, just continues, forever, in different forms, but always continuing, always killing, always destroying the ones who survived initial event, who thought they made it, who believed the worst was over. It wasn't, it never is. It never was. The worst is aftermath, is cascade, is forever. That follows every disaster, every catastrophe, every beer flood. That is the lesson, the real lesson, the important lesson that no one learns, that no one teaches, that no one wants to acknowledge, because it is too true, too painful, too hopeless, but true nonetheless, forever. The funerals are grim, grimmer than normal funerals, which is saying something, because this is 1814 London. Death is common. Funerals are frequent. People die young, die often, die suddenly. Funerals are part of life, regular part, expected part. But these funerals are different, because the bodies smell like beer, because the coffins are made from wood salvaged from beer, soaked rubble, because the whole event reeks, literally reeks, of beer, of tragedy, of absurdity. The smell won't leave, can't be washed away, can't be hidden. The deceased smell like they died drunk. They drowned sober, but they smell drunk, smell like beer forever. Their graves smell like beer. The cemetery smells like beer for weeks, for months. The beer has permeated everything. Even death, even burial, even final rest can't escape it, can't avoid it. The beer won. The beer marked them forever. That is their legacy. Drowned in beer, buried smelling like beer, remembered as the beer flood victims, not as people, not as individuals, as beer deaths, as statistics, as the punchline to history's darkest joke about the day London drowned in beer. The church service is packed, standing room only, not because so many people cared, but because curiosity, because spectacle, because everyone wants to see. The beer flood victims, the weird deaths, the absurd tragedy. They come to gawk, to witness, to collect story, to tell later at pub, over beer. Obviously, the irony escapes no one, except maybe the families in front row, grieving, broken, destroyed, while crowd behind whispers, speculates, entertains themselves with their tragedy, with their loss, with their dead. That is Victorian society. That is human nature. That is the cruelty of being victim of public tragedy, of spectacle death. Your grief becomes entertainment. Your loss becomes story. Your dead become characters in other people's narratives that they tell at parties, at social gatherings. Your worst moment, their best story. Your forever pain, their brief entertainment. That is the trade. That is the cost of public catastrophe, of famous disaster, of weird death. You lose everything. They gain story. You suffer forever. They forget tomorrow. That is the asymmetry. That is the injustice. That is the reality of being victim of public tragedy, of beer flood. Your pain, their entertainment, your loss, their trivia. You're forever their footnote. That is how it works. That is how it is always worked. That is how it always will work. Victims suffer. Others consume. Nothing changes. Nothing improves. Nothing learns from tragedy, from death, from catastrophe. Just entertainment, just story, just content for consumption by those it doesn't touch, it doesn't hurt, it doesn't affect. That is the church. That is the funeral. That is the service. Half grieving families, half curious spectators, half genuine mourners, half entertainment seekers, together, in same space. One suffering, one spectating, one destroyed, one entertained. That is humanity. That is society. That is how we treat victims of catastrophe. Make spectacle, make entertainment, make story of their pain, their loss, their death, and call it sympathy, call it caring, call it interest. When it is consumption, when it is entertainment, when it is using their suffering for our amusement, that is the funeral. That is the reality. That is the truth. We don't want to see, don't want to acknowledge, don't want to admit, but true, nonetheless, forever. Think about the physics, the actual physics of what happened. 388,000 gallons of beer, that is 3.2 million pounds, over 1,400 metric tons of liquid released instantly, all at once. The energy, the force, the momentum is immense, catastrophic, unstoppable. The wave moves at 15 to 20 miles per h. At is 22 to 29 feet per second. That is faster than you can run, faster than you can react, faster than you can escape. If you are in its path, you are dead. No maybe, no hope, no escape, just dead. The force is comparable to car crash, to building collapse, to being hit by wall of concrete, moving fast, because that is what it is, wall of liquid, moving fast, with all the force of 1,400 tons of momentum behind it. Nothing stops it, nothing slows it, nothing survives it. Not walls, not doors, not people. Everything in path is destroyed, crushed, drowned, killed. That is physics, that is force. That is why 8 people died. Not bad luck, not poor decisions, not anything they could control. Physics killed them, force killed them, momentum killed them. Being in wrong place when physics arrived with 1,400 tons of liquid death. That is what killed them, not beer, not flood, not accident. Physics, unstoppable physics, uncaring physics, deadly physics, of massive liquid in motion, seeking low ground, seeking basements, seeking you. That is what happened. That is why they died. That is the truth. Not act of God, act of physics, act of negligence. That put 1,400 tons of beer in wooden vat next to homes, next to basements, next to people, then let it fail. Let it rupture. Let physics do what physics does. Move mass. Seek equilibrium. Destroy obstacles. Including people. Including lives. Including everything. In its path. That is physics. That is what killed them. That is the truth. The provable. Measurable. Scientific truth. Not God's will. Not unavoidable. Not accident. Negligence plus physics equals death. That is the equation. That is the reality. That is what courts should have ruled. Not act of God, act of negligence, times physics, equals 8 death, plus trauma, plus aftermath, plus cascade of consequences that continue forever. That is the equation. That is the verdict. That should have been, but wasn't. Because courts serve capital, not truth, not justice, not physics. Just capital, always capital, over everything, including truth, including 8 dead people who physics killed, because negligence put them in physics's path. That is the truth, the complete truth, the unspoken truth that everyone knows, but no one says, because saying it means admitting. Negligence means assigning. Blame means holding accountable those responsible, and we can't have that. The system can't threaten capital, can't make corporations responsible for deaths they cause. So we blame God, blame physics, blame victims for being in wrong place at wrong time when physics arrived with 1,400 tons of negligence disguised as beer. That is the truth. That is the reality. That is what happened. On Monday, the 17th of October, 1814, in London at St Giles, where physics met negligence and killed 8 people who deserved better than drowning in beer on Monday, because corporation didn't maintain, didn't protect, didn't value their lives over profit. That is the truth, the final truth, the lasting truth. That courts denied, that system hid, that history forgot. But truth, nonetheless, forever. There are witnesses, hundreds of witnesses, people who saw, people who heard, people who experienced the flood, the wave, the destruction. They tell stories. Different stories, contradictory stories, true stories, all true, because catastrophe looks different from different places, from different perspectives, from different survival points. Some witnesses saw the wave, saw it coming, saw it hit. They describe wall of liquid, brown wall, foaming wall, moving fast, looking impossible, looking like nightmare, looking like end of world. They saw it, they barely escaped. They remember forever. Other witnesses heard it first, heard the roar, the explosion, the catastrophe arriving. They describe thunder sound, waterfall sound, end of world sound, getting louder, getting closer, getting deadly. They heard it. They ran. They survived. Because they heard. Warning. Approaching. Death. Some witnesses were inside. When it hit, they describe. Sudden darkness, sudden cold, sudden beer. Consuming everything, drowning everything. They were there. They survived. Barely they remember everything. Every moment, every second, every heartbeat. Of almost dying, of nearly drowning, of escaping, by luck, by chance, by nothing. They control. They remember and wish. They didn't wish they could forget, could erase, could remove the memory. The forever scar of the day they almost died in beer on Monday. While doing nothing wrong, nothing dangerous, nothing that deserved almost death. Just existing, just being there, just being poor in wrong neighborhood, next to brewery, with bad vats. That is all. That is enough. To almost die, to be traumatized, to be destroyed by catastrophe you didn't cause, couldn't prevent, couldn't escape, just survive, barely. By luck, then remember, forever against your will, against your wish, against everything that suggests, forget and move on. You can't, you won't, you never will. The memory stays, the trauma persists, the catastrophe lives, in you, through you, forever, until death, actual death, final death, that releases from memory, from trauma, from forever carrying the weight of almost dying in beer on Monday in London in 1814. That is witnesses, that is survivors, that is the living who wish they weren't, who remember everything, who carry forever the burden, the weight, the trauma of surviving beer flood, of witnessing catastrophe, of experiencing horror that never ends, never fades, never becomes bearable, just endured, just carried, just suffered, until death brings release, brings ending to endless memory, trauma, suffering. That is witnesses. That is their forever. That is the price of surviving, of seeing, of witnessing. Catastrophe that changes you forever in ways you can't explain, can't convey, can't make others understand unless they lived it, unless they saw it, unless they almost died. Then they'd know, then they'd understand. Then they'd stop saying, move on, get over it, forget it, because you can't, you don't, you never do. That is trauma, that is PTSD, that is forever carrying catastrophe inside you, where no one sees, where no one knows, where no one understands. The burden, the weight, the forever suffering of the ones who survived, who witnessed, who carry the beer flood forever inside, in memory, in trauma, in endless loop of that moment, that day, that Monday, that never ends for them, for witnesses, for survivors, never ends, just replays forever. That is the cost, the lasting cost of catastrophe. Not death, not drowning, but surviving and carrying and never forgetting and never healing from the day. The beer, the flood, the almost death, that became forever life, of suffering, of remembering, of carrying. What can't be carried, but must be, because you are alive, because you survived, because you witnessed catastrophe, and can never unwitness, unsurvive, unlive. That moment, that day, that forever. Monday, the 17th of October, 1814, London, St. Giles. Beer flood. That is witnesses. That is their burden. That is their forever. Living with unbearable, unforgettable, inescapable memory of the day. Everything almost ended, but didn't, leaving them alive, but destroyed, breathing, but dead inside, surviving, but wishing they hadn't. That is the witnesses. That is the survivors. That is the real victims of the beer flood, not the 8 who died, but the hundreds who survived and carry forever the weight of witnessing, of surviving, of remembering what should never have been, never have happened, never have happened, never have existed. Beer flood that killed 8 bodies and hundreds of souls who lived but died inside that day. That Monday forever. That is them. That is their story. That is what no one talks about, what no one sees, what no one counts when counting victims of catastrophe. The living who died inside, who suffer forever, while everyone else forgets and moves on and tells jokes about the day London drowned in beer. Still drowning, still dying, still suffering, forever, in memory, in trauma, in endless replay of that day. That moment, that beer, that almost death, that became worse than death, became living, with memory of almost dying. Forever, that is witnesses, that is survivors, that is the unseen, uncounted, unacknowledged victims of the London beer flood of the 17th of October, 1814, still suffering, still drowning, still dying, inside, where no one sees, where no one counts, where no one cares about the living, dead walking, breathing, suffering, forever. That is them. That is their forever. That is the beer flood. Real beer flood. Still flooding, still drowning, still killing. The ones who survived. That is the truth. The complete truth. The forever truth. Of catastrophe. Of disaster. Of beer flood. That never ends. For those who live through it and carry it forever. Until death brings mercy, brings ending, brings forgetting of the unforgettable. That is them. That is their hope. That is all. They have death as mercy, as release, as ending to endless suffering that started the 17th of October, 1814, and never stopped, never ended, never became bearable, just endured, just carried, just suffered. Finally mercifully comes and brings what life can't bring, forgetting, ending peace, from beer flood, from trauma, from memory that never fades, never ends, never stops, being catastrophe, being horror, being unbearable, until death brings ending. That is their hope, their only hope, their everything, death. As friend, as release, as mercy from life, after beer flood, after catastrophe, after surviving. What kills you, even when it doesn't kill you, it kills you, eventually, slowly, through trauma, through endless suffering. That looks like living, but isn't just dying, slowly, by memory, by trauma, by beer flood. That never stopped flooding, never stopped drowning, never stopped killing the ones it missed. The first time gets them, the second time, through memory, through trauma, through forever, carrying what can't be carried. Until death says enough, says release, and finally mercifully brings ending to endless suffering. That is witnesses, that is survivors, that is the beer flood, forever in them, until death, in everyone who saw, who lived, who survived. The 17th of October, 1814, London, St. Giles. The day, the beer, the flood. That never ended. Not really, not ever. Not ever. The economic impact is severe for the victims, for the neighbourhood, not for the brewery. The brewery survives, rebuilds, continues, but the neighbourhood suffers. The destroyed houses aren't rebuilt, not immediately, not properly. The families are displaced, homeless. Poor people made poorer by catastrophe, by beer. They can't afford rebuilding, can't afford repairs, can't afford anything. They lose homes, possessions, livelihoods, everything, and get nothing. No compensation, no support, no charity. Victorian charity exists, but it is selective, judgmental, moral. Did you deserve catastrophe? Were you virtuous enough? Are you the deserving poor? St. Giles residents aren't considered deserving. They're considered criminals. degenerates. Poor because of moral failure, because of choices. Not because of systemic poverty, not because of lack of opportunity, because of sin. That is the Victorian view. So they get no help, no charity, no relief. Just judgment, just condemnation. Just should have lived somewhere better, as if they had a choice. As if anyone chooses to live in basement slums. As if poverty is preference. It is not. It is circumstance. It is economy. It is Victorian capitalism. That creates slums, creates poverty, creates circumstances where people live in basements next to dangerous breweries, and then blames them when catastrophe strikes. That is the system. That is the justice. That is the society. Victorian England, progress and poverty, industry and death, beer and catastrophe. Think about the moment just before, the moment before everything changed, before the rupture, before the flood, before the deaths. Everyone was living, normal Monday, normal October afternoon, normal life, working, existing, surviving. Planning dinner, planning evening, planning tomorrow, normal plans, normal thoughts, normal everything. They had no idea, no warning, no sense. That in minutes, everything would end, everything would change, everything would be destroyed. They were just living normally, ordinarily, unremarkably, like every day, like yesterday, like tomorrow was supposed to be. But wouldn't be because catastrophe was approaching, was seconds away, was inevitable, and they didn't know, couldn't know, had no way to know that their normal Monday was ending, was becoming their last Monday, their last normal, their last everything. That is the cruelty of catastrophe, of disaster, of sudden death. The not knowing, the normal moment before abnormal moment, the last normal, before first catastrophe. That moment is precious, is important, is everything, in retrospect, but in moment it is nothing, it is normal, it is unremarkable, just Monday afternoon, just living, just existing, not knowing, that ending is approaching, is seconds away, is inevitable, that is everyone, that is all of us, living in that moment, that last normal, before catastrophe, before death, before everything changes, forever. Don't know when, don't know which Monday, which afternoon, which normal moment is the last one, before catastrophe, before the beer floods. That is the uncertainty, that is the terror, that is the reality. Any moment could be, last normal before catastrophe, before death, ending, we just don't know which, can't know which, won't know which until catastrophe arrives and normal ends forever. That is them. The 17th of October, 1814, 5:30 p.m. Last normal, before beer flood, before death, before everything changing forever. They didn't know, just living, just existing, just being normal, for last time ever. That is the moment, that is the cruelty, that is the reality of how catastrophe works. No warning, no preparation, no knowing, just normal, then catastrophe, then death, then everything, different, forever. That is them, that is us, that is everyone, living in that moment, that uncertain moment, that any moment, called to be last moment, not knowing, can't knowing, won't knowing, until catastrophe, until death, until normal, ends forever. That is the truth, uncomfortable truth, terrifying truth, real truth. Any Monday could be beer flood Monday. Any afternoon could be catastrophe afternoon. Any normal moment could be last normal. Before everything changes forever. We just don't know. Can't know. Live anyway, in uncertainty, in not knowing, in hoping that catastrophe misses us, forgets us, takes someone else, not us. That is hope. False hope, desperate hope. But hope, that keeps us living normally, ordinarily, despite knowing catastrophe is possible, is waiting. Someone, someday, maybe today, maybe you, maybe me, maybe Monday, maybe the 17th of October, maybe normal afternoon. That becomes catastrophe afternoon, death afternoon, last afternoon. Ever, that is reality, that is truth, that is life, in shadow of catastrophe. That could happen, any time, any place, any person. That is us, that is us, that is everyone, living, not knowing, when normal ends and catastrophe begins. That is the lesson, final lesson, universal lesson, from beer flood, from the 17th of October, from 8 deaths, from catastrophe that arrived. On normal Monday to normal people living normal lives in normal neighborhood and destroyed. Everything. In minutes. Without warning, without reason, without mercy. That is life. That is reality. That is truth. We all live. In that moment that last normal, before catastrophe, we just don't know which moment that is, until it happens, until normal ends, until catastrophe begins, until beer, floods, or whatever your catastrophe is. That is waiting for you, for me, for everyone, somewhere. In uncertain moment, that could be any moment. This moment, next moment, last moment of normal. Before catastrophe, that is life. That is death. That is everything. Uncertain, unpredictable, catastrophic, waiting for all of us. Eventually, that is the beer flood teaching, its final lesson to everyone who lives in shadow of catastrophe. That is coming someday, somehow, to someone. Maybe you, maybe me, maybe Monday. Maybe the 17th of October, maybe normal afternoon. That becomes forever catastrophe, forever memory, forever end of normal, and beginning of after. That is divided into before and after by catastrophe, by beer, by flood, by death, changing in moment, in instant, in rupture of normal, by catastrophe. That is life, that is reality, that is truth for them, for us, for everyone who lives, dies, experiences catastrophe. That ends, normal, forever, and begins after. That never ends, never heals, never becomes normal again, just after, forever after, catastrophe. That is them. That is beer flood. That is the 17th of October, 1814. That is lesson for all of us living in moments. Before catastrophe, not knowing which moment is last. Normal, before everything changes forever. That is life. That is beer flood, teaching final lesson to everyone who listens, who understands. That normal is temporary, catastrophe is permanent, and we all live in between, not knowing when one ends and other begins. That is them, that is us, that is everyone. Living, dying eventually by catastrophe, by beer, by whatever comes, unexpectedly, on Monday, on normal day, to normal people, and destroys everything forever. That is the lesson, that is the warning, that is the truth. From London, from 1814, from beer flood to everyone who lives after learning, remembering, knowing that normal can end any moment, by catastrophe, by beer, by flood, by anything that comes, without mercy, without reason, just comes, and destroys everything forever. That is life, that is death, that is truth, from beer, flood, to you, forever. But some people profit because someone always profits. From catastrophe, from tragedy, from death, the scavengers, the salvagers, the opportunists. They collect the beer, store it, sell it, illegally. On the black market, cheap beer, flood beer, death beer. People buy it, people drink it. People don't ask questions. Beer is beer. Cheap beer is better than expensive beer. Morality is luxury. Ethics are for people who aren't hungry, who aren't poor, who have choices. The poor don't have choices, just opportunities, just survival, just whatever it takes. So they drink flood beer, buy flood beer. Don't think about where it came from, what happened in it, who died in it. They just drink, because that is survival, that is poverty, that is making do with what is available, with what is affordable, with what is there. Even if it is beer from a flood that killed 8 people, even if it is beer mixed with sewage, even if it is beer that probably shouldn't be drunk. It is drunk, it is sold, it is consumed, for weeks, for months, until it is gone, until the supply runs out, until the flood beer is just memory, just history, just the weird thing that happened at one time, when the beer flooded London, when people died, when people drank the death beer anyway, because that is humanity, that is poverty. That is the Victorian response to catastrophe. Drink it, literally. Let's talk about the engineering failure, because this was an engineering failure, not an act of God, not unavoidable, preventable, completely preventable. The vats were too large, too ambitious, too confident. Victorian engineering was advancing rapidly. Steam engines, railways, massive infrastructure, impressive progress, but progress without caution, without testing, without safety margins. Engineers built bigger, faster, more impressive. without asking, should we? Only asking, can we? The answer to can we build a 22-foot tall wooden vat to hold 1 million pounds of beer is technically yes. You can, but should you? Without proper reinforcement, without maintenance schedules, without safety inspections, without backup systems, without any consideration for what happens when it fails? The answer is no. Obviously no. Catastrophically, no. But Victorian engineers didn't ask, they built, they assumed, they hoped. And when the vat failed, when the hoops broke, when the wood gave way, they acted surprised, shocked. How could this happen? How could anyone predict that 1 million pounds of liquid in a wooden container might eventually fail? How could anyone anticipate physics? Apparently the engineers couldn't, wouldn't. So people died, in beer, because engineers were ambitious, confident, wrong. The hoops that failed were wrought iron, strong iron, but iron fatigues, iron corrodes, iron breaks, under constant stress, constant pressure, constant strain. The hoops were under tension, always, for months, for years. Metal fatigues. Microscopic cracks form, propagate, grow, until suddenly, catastrophically, failure. This is known now. Material science understands this. Fatigue failure, stress cycles, failure modes. We know this now because of disasters like this, because of catastrophic failures, because of people dying. That is how engineering advances, through failure, through death, through learning what not to do. By doing it, killing people, then adding safety margins. Victorian engineering was learning, expensively, lethally. The beer flood taught lessons about vat size, about material limits, about maintenance, about safety, about not building massive pressurized containers next to residential neighborhoods. These lessons were learned, eventually, after 8 deaths. After catastrophe, after beer, that is progress, paid in lives, in suffering, in preventable tragedy. But progress nonetheless. The vats after this were smaller, better maintained, better reinforced, better safe. Not because of morality, because of lawsuits, because of bad publicity, because catastrophe is expensive. Even when courts call it act of God, even when corporations aren't held responsible, catastrophe still costs, still damages reputation, still hurts business. So safety improved, not from goodness, from economics, from avoiding future floods, from not wanting to be known as the brewery that drowned a neighborhood. That is progress. Reluctant progress, economically motivated progress. But progress, lives saved, not because they matter, because death is bad for business. The neighborhood recovers slowly, painfully, incompletely. The beer eventually drains, soaks away, evaporates, disappears mostly. The smell lingers for months, but fades. Eventually, the houses are rebuilt, some of them poorly, cheaply, but rebuilt. Life continues, because life always continues. People keep living, keep surviving, keep existing. In St. Giles, in poverty, in the shadow of the brewery, that still operates, still brews, still makes beer, in smaller vats, with better maintenance, with slightly more concern, but still there, still next to homes, just less obviously. Life returns to normal, Victorian normal, which means poor, dangerous, desperate but familiar, known survivable, until the next catastrophe, until the next disaster, until the next time something breaks and kills people and gets called act of God. That is life. In Victorian London, in poverty, in the Industrial Revolution, in the aftermath of progress. You live, you survive, you hope that you are not next, that catastrophe misses you, that the next flood is water, not beer, not death, just water, just normal disaster, not absurd disaster, not ridiculous disaster, not beer disaster. That hope sustains, that hope continues, that hope is all there is. In St. Giles, in 1814, after the beer flood, after the deaths, after the catastrophe, after the day the beer attacked and won. Think about the absurdity, really think about it. Death by beer flood, it sounds like a joke, like a movie plot, like something too ridiculous to be real, but it is real, it happened. 8 people, real people, died, drowned, in beer, on a Monday, going about their lives, working, having tea, existing, and then beer. Sudden beer, catastrophic beer, deadly beer, and they're gone, dead, in the most ridiculous way possible. You can't plan for this, can't anticipate this, can't prepare for beer flood. It is not a thing. It is not a risk. It is not something anyone worries about. Until it happens, then it is everything. It is disaster. It is death. It is tragedy, with an element of absurdity that makes it worse, makes it harder to process, harder to mourn, harder to take seriously. How do you eulogize someone who drowned in beer? How do you memorialize that death? How do you honor that tragedy without acknowledging the ridiculous, the absurd, the darkly comic? So it is remembered as the beer flood, the ridiculous disaster, the funny catastrophe, the weird history, not as 8 deaths, not as personal tragedies, as historical curiosity, as pub trivia, as the weird thing that happened that one time in London in 1814 when the beer attacked. That is the legacy. Not the victims, not the suffering, not the tragedy, the absurdity, the weirdness, the beer. That is what is remembered. That is what is preserved. That is what is passed down. The day London drowned in beer. Haha, how funny, how weird, how absurd. Except for the 8 people and their families and their neighbours. For them it wasn't funny, wasn't absurd, wasn't entertainment. It was death. Sudden death. Ridiculous death. Unfair death. Real death. That is forgotten. In the retelling. In the history. In the pub quiz. The deaths become statistics, become footnotes, become trivia. The beer becomes the story. The flood becomes famous. The absurdity becomes legend. And the people become forgotten again. As always, the poor die. The story lives. That is history. That is memory. That is what survives. Not justice. Not acknowledgement. Not even proper memorial. Just story. Just weird history. Just the time beer killed people. And everyone laughed. Because it is beer. Because it is absurd. Because death is only tragic when it is relatable. When it is normal. When it is expected. But ridiculous death. Absurd death. Beer death. That is entertainment. That is history. That is story. And the dead don't matter again. Still, forever. The brewery pays a price. Eventually, not legally, not morally, economically, indirectly. They lose 388,000 gallons of beer. That is product. That is inventory. That is money. Lots of money. Beer is valuable. Beer is taxed. Heavily taxed. The brewery has already paid tax on that beer. On the beer now flooding St. Giles. On the beer drowning people. On the beer soaking into the ground. That is lost tax. Lost money. Unrecoverable expense. The brewery petitions Parliament. Asks for tax relief. For reimbursement. For compensation. For their loss. Their catastrophe. Their act of God. Not for the victims. For themselves. For their lost beer. For their lost tax money. For their economic suffering. The audacity. The gall. The Victorian capitalism. They ask. Parliament considers. Parliament agrees. Parliament refunds the tax. Gives the brewery back the money. For the beer that killed 8 people. For the beer that destroyed homes. For the beer that devastated a neighbourhood. The brewery gets compensated. The victims get nothing. That is justice. That is the system. That is who matters. Corporations matter. Property matters. Tax revenue matters. People don't. Poor people especially don't. They're replaceable. Disposable. Forgettable. The beer isn't. The money isn't. The brewery isn't. They're important. They're protected. They're compensated. The people die. The brewery profits. That is Victorian England. That is capitalism. That is history. Always the same story. Different catastrophes. Same outcome. The poor die. The rich profit. The system protects property. Ignores people and calls it act of God when it is act of negligence, act of greed, act of indifference, act of system working as designed, protecting capital, ignoring casualties. That is the design. That is the purpose. That is the truth. Hidden behind act of God, behind legal language, behind Victorian respectability. The truth is, people don't matter. Poor people don't matter. Their deaths don't matter. Their lives don't matter. Only property, only profit, only capital, that matters. That is protected. That is preserved. That is what the system is for. The beer flood proves it. 8 deaths. 0 accountability. Full compensation for the brewery. None for the victims. That is not justice. That is clarity. Clear demonstration of who matters, who doesn't, who the system serves, who it sacrifices. Crystal clear. Beer, soaked clear. Dead body clear, but ignored. dismissed, forgotten. Because acknowledging it means changing it, and change threatens profit, threatens system, threatens those who benefit. So it is ignored, called God's fault, called unavoidable, called tragic accident. And nothing changes, nothing improves, nothing learned, except by the engineers, who make that smaller, not because they care, because the next flood might hit rich neighborhoods, might kill important people, might actually matter. That is the only lesson. That is the only change. Protect the rich by slightly improving safety for everyone. Incidentally, not intentionally, but incidentally. That is progress. Under capitalism, protect the important. Accidentally help the rest. That is the best you get. The most you hope for. Incidental safety. Accidental improvement. As side effect of protecting profit. That is the system. That is history. That is the beer flood's real lesson. Not the absurdity, not the death, the system. Who it serves, who it kills, who it compensates, who it forgets. That is the lesson. That is the truth. That is what matters. More than beer, more than flood, more than death, the system. Always the system, protecting itself by sacrificing you. You probably think this couldn't happen today, in modern times, with modern engineering, with modern safety, with modern everything. You are mostly right. Mostly modern vats are steel, not wood. Modern engineering has safety factors, redundancies, testing, maintenance schedules, inspections, regulations, safety culture. We've learned from disasters, from deaths, from catastrophes like the beer flood. We've built better, safer, more carefully. The chance of a beer flood in modern London, in modern anywhere, is vanishingly small, nearly zero, nearly but not zero. Because systems fail, because maintenance gets deferred, because cost cutting happens, because regulations are seen as burden, because safety culture erodes under pressure, under profit motive, under it has been fine so far mentality. Catastrophe always seems impossible until it happens, until something fails, until the unthinkable occurs, and people die. In ridiculous ways, in preventable ways, in ways that afterwards seem obvious, seem inevitable, seem like someone should have known, should have prevented, should have cared, but didn't. Because caring costs, because safety costs, because prevention costs, and profit demands, and systems optimize. For profit, not safety, not always, not consistently, not reliably. So catastrophe waits, patiently, for the next failure, the next cost cutting, the next probably fine, and then happens again, differently. But same result. People die, systems fail. And afterwards everyone says this must never happen again, until it does. Because systems don't learn, corporations don't change. Profit still matters more than people. Still, today, always. The beer flood isn't ancient history, isn't quaint disaster, isn't safely in the past. It is lesson, relevant lesson, current lesson, about systems, about priorities, about who matters when profit and safety conflict. Profit wins, usually not always, but usually enough to keep catastrophe possible, keep disaster waiting, keep death preventable but not prevented. That is modern, that is now, that is you. Living in a system that still values profit over people, over safety, over care. The beer flood is historical. The lesson isn't. The system isn't. The danger isn't. It is still there, still waiting, still possible. Different form, same essence. Catastrophe waiting. For cost cutting, for deferred maintenance, for probably fine, for act of God. That is really act of negligence, hidden, denied, profitable. That is the real flood, the ongoing flood, of indifference, of profit over people, of systems that sacrifice, for benefit of few, at expense of many. That flood never stopped, never drained, never ended, still here, still drowning people, just slower, more gradually, less obviously, but continuously. The beer flood was sudden, dramatic, visible. The modern flood is chronic, systemic, hidden, but same flood, same system, same priorities, same sacrifices, same deaths, just spread out, over time, over population, over circumstances, invisible, until you look, until you see, until you recognize the flood never ended, the system never changed, the priorities never shifted, people still don't matter, profit still wins, catastrophe still waits, act of God still protects corporations from responsibility, from consequences, from change. That is the flood. The real flood. Not beer. System drowning humanity. Slowly. Surely. Profitably. Since 1814. Since before. Since always until change. Real change, system change. Not just engineering change. Not just safety change. Priority change. Value change. That is the flood that needs stopping. That is the vat that needs draining. That is the catastrophe that needs preventing. Not just beer floods. System floods, profit floods. Indifference floods. Those keep killing, keep drowning, keep sacrificing people, lives, futures for profit. For system, that needs ending, that needs changing, that needs revolution. Not just regulation, that is the real lesson of the beer flood, of 1814, of history, of now. Change the system, or it keeps flooding, keeps killing, keeps calling it God's fault, when it is our fault, system's fault, choice's fault, priority's fault. Change them, change system, stop flood. Real flood, ongoing flood, that one not beer. System always system. That is the flood, that is the catastrophe. That is what needs ending. Now, today, before next disaster, before next death, before next act of God, that is really act of profit, act of system, act of choice. Change system, stop flood, save people. That is the lesson. If we listen, if we care, if we act, otherwise flood continues, system continues, death continues, just waiting. For you, for everyone. For next catastrophe, next Monday, next impossible disaster, next beer flood, different beer, same flood, same deaths, same lesson, unlearned again, forever, until change, real change, revolutionary change, that is what is needed. That is what the beer flood teaches, not just build better vats, but value people, over profit, over property, over everything. People first, always. That is the change. That is the lesson. That is the flood stopper. Will it happen? Ask the system. Ask the dead. They know. They always know. System doesn't change until forced, until threatened, until catastrophe affects those who matter, those who profit, those who make rules, everyone else. Sacrificed. Acceptable losses. Collateral damage, acts of God. That is the answer. That is the truth. That is the flood. Still flowing, still drowning, still waiting. For you, be ready. Or be victim, or be revolutionary. Those are options. Choose before the flood, before the beer, before Monday, before act of God, before death. Choose. Change or drown. System or people, profit or lives. Choose. History chose. 8 people died. Brewery profited. That was choice. That is choice. That will be choice. Our choice. Your choice. Human choice. Over system choice, over profit choice, over death choice. Choose life, choose people, choose change. That is the answer. The only answer. To floods. All floods, beer or otherwise. Choose people over everything. That is the lesson. The final lesson, the real lesson. From London, from 1814. From beer flood, from 8 deaths, from act of God, from system, from history. Choose change. Live. Don't drown. In beer, in system, in profit, in indifference, in acts of God, that are acts of people, acts of system, acts of choice. Make different choice. Be the change. Stop the flood. That is the end, the lesson, the truth. From beer, from history, from death, to you, to now, to future. Choose life, choose people, always people, over profit, over system, over everything. That is the answer, the only answer. The right answer, from the London beer flood of 1814, to you, to now, forever. Choose wisely. Imagine standing at that corner today, right now, at the intersection of Tottenham Court Road, a new street where the brewery was, where the vat stood, where the catastrophe began. You are standing there, modern London, cars passing, people walking, life happening, normal life, city life, nothing remarkable, just corner, just street, just Monday. Any Monday, every Monday, you look around, try to imagine 400,000 gallons of beer flooding this street, this intersection, these buildings. You can't. It is impossible. Too big, too ridiculous, too impossible to imagine. But it happened, right here, right where you are standing, on this street, in this place. The 17th of October, 1814, the beer flooded. Right here. People drowned. Right here. 8 people died. Somewhere nearby. In basements. In homes. In buildings. that no longer exist, that were demolished, that were replaced by modern buildings, modern street, modern London, that has forgotten, completely forgotten, the beer flood, the deaths, the catastrophe. There is no plaque, no memorial, no marker, nothing. That says, here on this spot, 8 people drowned in beer on Monday in 1814 because of negligence, because of profit, because of system. That valued beer over lives. Nothing marks it, nothing acknowledges. That here. Right here, catastrophe happened. Death occurred. People died. In the most absurd way possible. And the city just moved on. Built over it. Forgot it. Erased it. From landscape. From a memory. From acknowledgement. That is what cities do. To uncomfortable history. To embarrassing catastrophe. To stories that don't fit. The narrative of progress, of improvement, of civilization. They erase. They forget. They build over and pretend. It never happened. Never existed. Never mattered. The 8 people who died here don't matter to modern London, to modern city, to modern world. They're forgotten, erased, built over, literally built over. You are standing on their graves, on their deaths, on their catastrophe. And you don't know, can't know, won't ever know, unless you learn, unless you research, unless you care about the forgotten, the erased, the built over, dead, who matter to no one anymore. That is them. That is their legacy. That is their memorial. Nothing. Absolute nothing. Not even mention. Not even acknowledgement. That they existed. That they died. That they mattered. To someone once. Long ago, on Monday, in October. In 1814. When the beer drowned a neighbourhood. Killed 8 people. Changed everything for survivors. For witnesses, for families. Who lost everything in beer. On that corner where you are standing. Not knowing, not caring, not remembering, that is their memorial. Your indifference. The city's forgetfulness, history's erasure. That is what they get. For dying absurdly, for dying in beer, for dying in way. That is entertainment. Not tragedy. That is trivia. Not history. That is joke. Not death. They get. Forgotten. Erased. Built over literally, figuratively, completely. That is them. That is their fate. That is their forever. Being forgotten. By city. By history. By everyone who walks that corner, that street, that place, where they died, and doesn't know, doesn't care, doesn't remember, that 8 people died here, drowned here, in beer, on Monday, long ago, but not. That long ago, but not. Not really 200 years, that is nothing, that is recent. That is practically yesterday, in historical terms, in civilizational terms, in human terms, 200 years, is nothing, is yesterday, is still relevant, still important, still mattering, or should matter, but doesn't, because we forgot, because we erased, because we built over their deaths, their catastrophe, their absurd, tragic, ridiculous, real deaths, in beer, on Monday, the 17th of October, 1814. London St. Giles, gone, forgotten, erased, built over. That is the final insult, the lasting injury, the forever injustice. Not just dying absurdly, dying in beer, dying for no reason, but being forgotten, being erased, being built over, literally, by city. That doesn't remember, doesn't care, doesn't acknowledge that you died, that you mattered, that you existed. That is the final death, the complete death, the forever death, physical death, in beer, memorial death, in forgetting, legacy death, in erasure, triple death, complete death, forever death. That is worse than drowning, than beer, than Monday, being forgotten, being erased, being nothing to everyone who comes after, who walks where you died, who stands on your grave and doesn't know, doesn't care, doesn't remember you, your death, your catastrophe, your everything, gone, forgotten, erased, forever. That is the beer flood victims. That is their fate. That is their reality. Today, now, forever, nothing. To no one, nowhere, just gone completely. Finally, forever. That is the real tragedy. Not the death, the forgetting, not the drowning, the erasure, not the beer flood, the memorial drought, of care, of memory, of acknowledgement that you lived, that you died, that you mattered. Once, to someone, before being forgotten, erased, built over, by city, by history, by everyone, who forgot, who erased. You, from everything, from acknowledgement, from mattering, that is you, beer flood victims. The 17th of October, 1814, London, St. Giles. 8 people, drowned in beer, forgotten by history, erased by city, built over, by progress. That didn't include remembering you, honouring you, acknowledging that you died, that you mattered, that you existed. Now you are nothing, nowhere. Just trivia, just footnote, just weird story about the day London drowned in beer. Haha, how funny, how weird, how absurd. While 8 people, real deaths, real tragedies, are reduced to punchline, to trivia, to entertainment. For people who don't know, who don't care, who don't remember that you were real, human, important to someone. Forgotten, erased, built over forever. City, that doesn't remember. History, that doesn't care. World, that moved on, leaving you behind. Forgotten, erased, dead, triple dead, forever dead. That is the beer flood. Real beer flood. Final beer flood. Forever beer flood. Of forgetting, of erasing, of not mattering to anyone anymore, ever. That is the lesson. Final lesson. Lasting lesson of the London beer flood of 1814. Not the absurdity, not the deaths, not the beer, the forgetting, the erasure, the not mattering to anyone, who comes after, who walks, where you died, who stands, on your grave, and doesn't know, doesn't care. You, that is the flood, the real flood, the forever flood, that drowns everyone eventually in forgetting, in erasure, in not mattering, to the future. That is the lesson, the warning, the truth. From 8 people who drowned in beer on Monday, the 17th of October, 1814. Giles, and were forgotten, erased, built over, by everyone who came after, including you, standing at that corner, not knowing, not caring, not remembering them. That is the flood, that is the tragedy, that is the truth. We all drown, eventually, not in beer, in forgetting, in erasure, in not mattering. To anyone who comes after, that is the real flood, the universal flood, the forever flood. That gets everyone, even you, eventually. When you are forgotten, when you are erased, when you are built over, by progress, by city, by history. That moves on, without you, leaving you behind. Forgotten, erased, nothing. Like the 8 who drowned in beer on Monday in London in 1814. Gone, forgotten, nothing, forever. That is everyone, that is everything. That is the flood, the real flood, the final flood. That drowns us all, in time, in forgetting, in not mattering anymore. That is the London beer flood, teaching its final lesson to you, to everyone, to all of us who think we'll be remembered, will matter, we'll be different. We won't, we aren't, we're all eventually forgotten, erased, built over, like them, like the 8, like everyone who came before and will come after, all forgotten, all erased, all nothing, eventually. That is the flood, the real flood, the forever flood, of time, of forgetting, of not mattering to anyone anymore, ever. That is the truth, final truth, complete truth, from London, from 1814, from beer flood, from 8 deaths, from forgotten victims, to you, to everyone, to future, that will forget, will erase, will build over, you, like them, like everyone, eventually, forever. That is the flood, that drowns everyone, in time, in forgetting, in nothing. That is the lesson, that is the warning, that is the truth. From the London beer flood of the 17th of October, 1814, to you, to everyone, to forever. We all drown, eventually, not in beer, in forgetting. That is worse. That is forever. Remember that, while you can, before you are forgotten, too.